If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 26-26 He's here. Everyone, fall back. Grayson received a stern order from Councilor Mel, once again exerting pressure on the Undercity. But when they approached the vicinity of the Undercity, Grayson signaled for a group of over a dozen to return to the elevator leading to the upper city. Captain, why are we? One of the enforcers questioned Grayson with confusion, but his words were cut off by a displeased look from Grayson. I said fall back. Can't you understand? Grayson responded sharply. Sevika, why didn't you go with Vander? Sevika glanced at Six, who was being closely watched by Greg, and remained silent. Are you also left behind by Vander and Linwen? Sevika, you're a formidable fighter, and you don't. That's enough, Six. Sevika shook her head while holding a glass of liquor, and said in a hushed tone, keep your thoughts to yourself. You're not the type to think with your head. Sevika had a sharp tongue, as always. I wasn't left behind, I was forced to stay behind to keep an eye on those who were actually left behind. You. Powder sat there, seemingly indifferent. In reality, she didn't mind staying in the tavern or what she did, as long as she was with Six. She didn't particularly enjoy fighting. Sevika placed a hand on Six to restrain her attempts to resist and sneered, be a good kid and sit down. Upper City. A large room at the University of Piltover, a space that was initially meant for experimental equipment, was now the exclusive research lab of Mr. Tallis. A spacious laboratory, covering hundreds of square meters in size. This was an accommodation usually reserved for funded professors, but now, it was allocated to 2 students who had recently gained some recognition. Linear, damn it. Victor, why hasn't he returned yet? Calm down, Jace. He's only been gone for a day, Victor said, setting down his magnifying glasses, looking at Jace's frustrated outburst with resignation. He will return once he's done with his own matters. What could be more important than the groundbreaking research of Hextech? And I specifically asked him to be part of it. Jace took a deep breath, still discontent. Hello, gentlemen. The sound of footsteps echoed, and the door swung open. Professor Heimerdinger stood there, stroking his beard. Oh? Where's Linwen? Professor, he's dealing with some personal matters. Oh, what about moving those heavy items of mine? Who will help me? Professor Heimerdinger stood there, stroking his beard, looking first at Victor and then finally fixing his gaze on Jace. Jace's intellect was certainly not lacking. He immediately spoke up, let me handle it, Professor. Are you sure you're up to the task? Of course, I come from a family of hammer makers. I'm strong in this area. Jace patted his chest with confidence. 10 minutes later. Heimerdinger clasped his hands, looking concernedly at Jace. My boy, are you really up to this task? You must be very careful, these are my precious experimental apparatus. Please, don't break anything. Jace blushed and said, I'm sorry, Professor. It's okay, my boy. Your strength doesn't have any bearing on your academic capabilities. You don't need to apologize. Jace nodded, but his fists were clenched. Linwen, you rascal, come back soon. Only one day without Linwen, and Mr. Tallis was already missing him. While Linwen might not assist with research directly, his physical capabilities were exceptional. He possessed immense strength, comparable to a cart's, and keen observational skills. Now, Jace realized just how important Linwen was. At 3 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, in a trendy and bustling tavern deep within Zaun, 3 individuals with distinct appearances sat separately in the closed-off owner's room. Vander is different now. I have eyes, I can see. Fiden died yesterday, killed by Sevika. The fat man with one eye chuckled, Sevika? She doesn't have that kind of strength. You've all seen the effects of Shimmer, it's not something ordinary people can withstand. I admit Sevika can fight well, but even if she had a gun, she couldn't possibly take on dozens of those monsters who've taken Shimmer. I know, I'm only saying that Fiden died by her blade. The tavern's owner, a tall woman with prosthetic limbs, adjusted her thigh, stretching it forward, and spoke, Now, what should we do? Silco only gave me a dozen vials of Shimmer. I have about the same. He gave me only 9 vials. Fiden had several excellent guns from the upper city, and Silco provided over a dozen vials of Shimmer. Moreover, Based on the scene, they all used shimmer, but even so, they couldn't handle him. He did it alone. The woman took a deep breath, raised her hand, and said loudly, I propose that we surrender, join Vander. What are you thinking? Join Vander? Are you out of your mind? The fat man objected, join him? Joining him will only make us poorer, he doesn't allow his people to sell that stuff. Without the goods, how will we make money? Do you have a better plan? Or are you planning to be his enemy? The alchemical baroness looked at him, speaking coldly. The fat man, known as Yaji, broke out in a cold sweat and stuttered, we can remain neutral, like we used to. Jing Cray, what do you think? Yaji looked towards the other person. I don't know. The third person, known as Jing Cray, said, stuttering, but I don't think this plan will work. On the Day of Ashes, when Vander asked us to join him and cross the bridge, we refused, and he didn't say much when he returned. But now, he wants to unite Zaun, and we want to stay neutral. I don't think he'll accept this proposal. Yaji got a bit angry. He went to die, and he wants us to go with him? Who's as stupid as him? But Vander has results. After all, Black Alley has been the most stable place in Zaun in recent years, Jing Cray spoke. The alchemical baroness was feeling a headache. She rubbed her temples and looked down at the table. Just like Yaji said, if they joined Vander, her business would surely decline, as Vander would never allow his people to sell their products. Her tavern couldn't thrive based on alcohol alone. No, that stuff didn't make any money. Her establishment thrived by selling to the poor of the Undercity. However, Vander wouldn't permit the sale of that product. Her tavern was only able to flourish in this generation because of it. Vander changed when he returned, causing a lot of people to worry. He was now fully aware of the strengths and weaknesses of their alliance. He could unite the whole of Zaun. This is also one of the reasons many people are unwilling to let Vander become the leader. So, of course, she didn't want to join Vander. But if they didn't join Vander, Yaji and Jing Cray were still arguing. Jing Cray felt that if they didn't join Vander, when he came looking for them, losing a leg or an arm would be a minor issue. Losing their lives, just like Phaidon, was also a real possibility. Yaji, on the other hand, was more concerned about his business. Without his business, those under him wouldn't heed his orders. These two guys. She looked at her glass helplessly. In the glass, yellow liquid trembled as the two men occasionally slammed the table. While thinking about the situation, she watched. Then, a bead of sweat, the size of a bean, rolled down her cheek, dropping onto the table. She felt her body growing cold and stiff. She slowly retracted her extended prosthetic leg, feeling a hidden pain radiating from her leg. She had been using this leg for 3 years now, but at this moment, she felt pain from the prosthetic. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and she was afraid. On the ceiling, there was someone. But she dared not look up. She could only cautiously watch her glass. In the reflection of the liquid, she saw him. He sat leisurely on the beam, wearing a white mask. He had his legs crossed and playfully swung them. The mask was lifted upward, revealing his lower face as he nonchalantly took a bite of a piece of bread, but no sound came out. He looked so relaxed. Yet there was still a bit of yellow debris falling in front of her eyes, dropping onto the table. Near her ears, the two fools were still arguing. Completely oblivious. He was already here. Right above them. / about the names of the Chem Barons, I've tried to search their names but nothing close came up. The names were probably made up since there's many nameless Baron. So names like Phaidon, Yaji, and Jing Cray are all my own translation / Chapter 27-27 Hope. You two, stop arguing, my head is already throbbing, she said, trying to calm her inner turmoil. She resisted the urge to look up and instead focused on Yaji and Jing Cray. Yaji, I still suggest aligning with Vander. Are you crazy? Your business has already reached the upper city. Do you really want to join Vander? Won't that ruin your business? Business, Yaji. I think the one going crazy here is you. Jing Cray frowned, slammed his hand on the table, and yelled at Yaji, isn't your life more important than business? He might not necessarily kill us. When Jing Cray was about to refute, Yaji preemptively interrupted him, shouting, don't bring up Phaidon. He brought trouble upon himself. He intruded into the Black Ally, stole guns from the upper city, and broke Vander's rules. His fate was well deserved. But we are different. As long as we behave and stay in our territory, he won't come after us. Even without our business, I won't be able to control my people, feed them. When the time comes, I'll be the one they devour. Yaji roared. Jing Cray stepped forward, confronted Yaji, and said with fury, "You fool, Vander is clearly aiming to unify all of Zaun. Do you really think that the same neutrality as before is possible? This time, they are determined to reform Zaun. As a fence-sitter like us, we'll be their first target. Don't you understand that? Then he will try to recruit us." "Recruit? Yaji, he's Vander, the Hound of the Undercity. Do you really think he'll have trouble taking control of your people after eliminating you and your territory?" Yaji and Jing Cray began arguing again, making the woman standing on the side very nervous. Death sat above them, and no one could calm down. She feared that their argument might anger Death, who would then come down and deliver his judgment. "Enough, Yaji," the Lady Baron said, shaking her head as she looked at Yaji. "I share the same thoughts as Jing Cray. We intend to ally with Vander. Are you insane?" "I'm not insane, Yaji. Just as Jing Cray said, the truly insane one here is you." The Lady Baron continued earnestly, "If this business is lost, we can find other ways to make a living. Whether it's Shurima or Nakos, there will always be countries in need of our smuggling services, plenty of opportunities to make money. But if we lose our lives, Yaji, then it's over. 2 votes against 1. If you still accept our alliance, then please believe me, Yaji." "My hunches are never wrong," Jing Cray said sincerely to Yaji. The 3 of them formed an alliance and controlled the area, with a combined number of followers that exceeded 100. They had established a large gang in Zaun, and it's worth noting that the total of their underlings outnumbered Vander's Black Hounds in the Undercity. Yaji hesitated, as he had stated before. Jing Cray and the Lady Baron were fully willing to ally with Vander, accepting the situation as it was. But Yaji couldn't do the same. He maintained control over the people under him through money. If he lost the business and his source of income, it wouldn't take long before trouble started, not with the underprivileged people in his territory but among his own subordinates. For this, not joining Vander would most likely lead to death. But even if they didn't die, life without business, wealth, status, and power would be indistinguishable from death. However, just as Yaji was about to try and persuade the others, an unexpected hiccup interrupted him. Yaji stared blankly behind the Lady Baron, at the window. There, a man in a white robe, wearing a mask, sat on the windowsill. He held a short sword and calmly rested with one hand in a half-eaten piece of bread, stuffing the rest into a bag. You. The Lady Baron, catching Yaji's gaze, knew what he had seen but dared not turn around. She feared that if she did, a sword would be the first thing she'd encounter. After all, that same person had chopped off her leg years ago. "Black Ice, let's hear it. When did you notice me?" Linwen asked, smiling and patting the Lady Baron's shoulder with the sword in his hand. Just a moment ago," Black Ice answered truthfully, realizing that deception wouldn't work. "I can't believe you noticed me. You didn't even raise your head." Linwen shook his head, seemingly impressed. He was perplexed about how his extraordinary stealth skills could fail. He possessed nearly 200 points of agility and entered the room 3 steps ahead of the trio. Yet, he was still discovered. "Sir, I accidentally saw you from the water in the cup," Black Ice hastily explained. Linwen fell silent, contemplating his stealth skills. He imagined that top-class family spies would avoid such minor mistakes. After all, hanging from the ceiling and thinking he was dashing, he was exposed by a simple glass of water. "Well, you seem sincere in what you're saying," Linwen said, patting Black Ice's shoulder with the sword's blade. The seemingly affectionate gesture sent shivers down her spine. Linwen realized that Black Ice might have discovered him from her peculiar behavior. Her voice might sound calm, but Linwen could sense the tremor in it. She was scared. This indicated that her proposal to align with Vander was genuine and trustworthy. Finally, Linwen turned his attention to Jing Cray, nodding his approval. "Jing Cray, you're not bad. Your perspective on the bigger picture is quite good." Jing Cray remained silent, lowering his head. "However, you..." Linwen turned to Yaji, the Chem Baron who ruled this part of Zaun. Yaji stood before Linwen, trembling and unable to control his quivering legs. "Have you genuinely thought this through?" Yaji's response wasn't surprising. The so-called alchemical baron, despite sounding impressive, was nowhere near as impressive as Vander's Black Hound. After Linwen's personal encounter with them, he couldn't help but think that perhaps distance enhanced their appeal. In reality, these so-called chem barons were nothing more than bigger gang leaders. When dealing with the enforcers, they wouldn't even dare release a fart. The reason there were so many chem barons in Zaun was not that Piltover couldn't manage them, but rather because Piltover intentionally allowed them to thrive. The presence of these chem barons allowed for efficient management of various districts within Zaun. When issues arose, they didn't need to search hard for individuals, just a signal, and these chem barons would deliver the culprits. Baron? Ha! Business or life? Linwen asked Yaji. You can't do this. I haven't broken any rules, Yaji's teeth chattered as he feared Linwen. In Zaun, there was not a single baron who wasn't afraid of Linwen. Since a certain baron's head served as a tool for him one fateful night, many considered targeting Linwen in the future. However, each attempt was effortlessly thwarted by him, leading to another round of bloodshed. Over time, the title of Undercity's enforcer gained recognition. Vander and Silco were Zaun's top powers in the past. Indeed, they were. However, Zaun's top powers had changed. I can align with Vander, as long as he allows me to continue doing business. Sir, you know that without business, it's not just me who gets affected, it's all of Zaun. We can't afford to lose this livelihood. Enough of your nonsense, Linwen interrupted Yaji, impatiently. I was discussing the rules of our family with one of our kids last night, and now, I have to repeat it today. Yaji, are you trying to talk to me about the rules? Black Ice, who made the rules in the first place? Yaji was bewildered. Black Ice immediately answered, it's you, sir. See, Yaji. Linwen emphasized. Are you trying to discuss rules with the person who sets the rules? Linwen's tone changed. I just modified this rule now. What are you going to do about it? He made a slight gesture with his wrist, and in an instant, blood gushed. In front of Linwen, the man didn't even have time to react. One massive arm had already fallen to the ground. Ah! As Yaji came to his senses, he immediately clutched his arm with his other hand and writhed in agony on the ground. Both Black Ice and Jing Cray swallowed nervously, beads of sweat forming on their temples. Talking about the rules? I said you shouldn't sell drugs, but did you comply? Linwen sneered and glanced at the other two. Then he lowered his head to look at Yaji and spoke indifferently, the production of this junk was a mistake from the start. You knew its harm, yet you continued to sell it so openly in the Undercity. If you were selling it in the Upper City and making the topsiders taste it, I might praise you folks for it. But you confined it to the Undercity, so what does that make you? Black Ice and Jing Cray remained silent, not daring to utter a word. In the room, there was only Linwen's cold voice, along with the sounds of snot and tears, and the loud cries of pain from Yaji. Black Ice and Jing Cray observed Yaji in this state, and both felt a trace of pity. But they couldn't display it in front of Linwen, as they knew they had no right to feel pity. The scene of Yaji's agony was something they had witnessed far too often, and the culprits responsible for these sights were individuals like themselves, the Chem Barons. Don't waste my time, I'm busy, Linwen said, I'm asking you for the second time. Linwen rested the point of his sword against the back of Yaji's head and spoke emotionlessly, business or life. If Yaji's response contained anything that didn't meet Linwen's expectations in the first 3 words, then this small Duran's blade in Linwen's hand would instantly penetrate Yaji's skull. Linwen certainly didn't like killing, but surviving in a place like Zaun made him gradually grow indifferent. Moreover, the circumstances demanded it now. For the greater cause of Zaun, Linwen was willing to be that blade. Sometimes, the hindrance to Zaun's rise and independence wasn't just the oppression from the topsiders in Piltover but also the internal conflicts within Zaun itself. Yaji, Black Ice, and Jing Cray were such individuals. In their eyes, it was all about money, and lately, they had even started to enjoy the luxuries. Despite their origins in the Undercity, they had recently bought several houses in the boundary market near Piltover and even planted flowers. In Zaun, that was considered a luxury. 1. 2. I choose life. Yaji was on the ground, his face pressed against Linwen's shoe, muttering these words. Good choice, Linwen said with a smile when he heard Yaji's response. He sheathed his sword. Black Ice, tell me everything you know about Silco. Understood. Several minutes later, Black Ice had divulged information about Silco. Before leaving, Linwen issued one final warning to the three. Yaji nodded while clutching his severed hand, hoping Linwen would depart so he could get someone to reattach his arm. Mechanically augmented limbs were never as functional as the original ones. Linwen, however, didn't linger. Just as he had mentioned earlier, time was of the essence. Late at night, there would be no residents of Zaun's Undercity walking the streets. The only individuals who ventured out late at night were Zaun's most ruthless criminals. Even ordinary thugs and gang members didn't dare roam the dark alleys of Zaun at night. That's because, it just needs one night, by the following morning, the lucky ones might become unrecognizable corpses but still claimed by familiar faces. In an abandoned garage with a sign that read Big Crab, a sudden whistle echoed through the air. Linwen's whistle immediately shattered the quiet atmosphere around. "Stop hiding, I know you're here," Linwen called out loudly, stamping his foot. But there was no response from anyone. It wasn't until Linwen bent down, his fist aimed at a corner of the floor. 1, 2. Linwen began counting. After only 2 counts, the lights in the warehouse came on. Linwen turned around to see Silco standing on the second floor, his hands resting on the railing, gazing deeply at him. "I haven't offended you this time, have I? Without your encouragement, would Phaidon have dared to cause trouble?" Linwen looked at Silco, and behind him stood several burly men and the frail Singed. "I didn't encourage him. I only sold him a few bottles of shimmer and told him what it could do," Silco explained. "Does that count as encouragement?" Linwen shook his head. "When talking to Silco, you had to be careful not to get carried away by his thoughts. Following this guy's line of thinking could easily brainwash you." He had to admit, Silco had a strong personality. He had charismatic leadership qualities. "Silco, this time I'm not here to cause trouble for you," Linwen said. "Though you didn't listen to me, which annoyed me, I also know you're not afraid of death, so I don't need to threaten you like I did Yaji. Where did you find me? Black Ice and the others don't have my contact details." "My rear end isn't as big as theirs," Silco said with a hint of humor. "You can continue your research on shimmer, but you're not allowed to distribute it." Silco remained silent, waiting for Linwen to continue. "At least until you've eliminated the side effects, don't let me see anyone selling shimmer in Zaun. The experimental data is essential for the research process. Without it, where can I get the data?" Singed spoke up from behind Silco. "I don't care," Linwen shook his head but continued, "Also, Silco, and the alchemist behind you. Rather than shimmer, I have something better. Are you willing to consider it?" Linwen took a blue crystal from his pocket. Silco squinted, and his eye, contaminated by toxins, with its crimson pupils, momentarily contracted. "What is this?" Silco asked. Linwen held up the crystal and explained, "It's called Hex Crystal. It's a brighter hope than your shimmer." Chapter 28-28 Cooperation. "You're too far away." Silco squinted his eyes and gestured. "My eyesight might not be as good as you think, so could you please throw it up for me to see?" Upon hearing Silco's request, Linwen remained silent, looking at him thoughtfully. Linwen hesitated, contemplating whether to throw the Hextech crystal. Although Linwen didn't believe the explosion of the Hextech crystal would harm him, he was quite certain it would be problematic for Silco. He really was as skinny as a monkey. "Are you sure? I think your idea might not be the best," Linwen shrugged, holding the Hextech crystal between his 2 fingers. The crystals in his hand were different from the ones now used in the laboratories of Jace and Victor. The latter had developed improved versions of the crystals. As a result, the crystals in the laboratory were smoother and resembled a sphere. The one in Linwen's hand had edges with various lengths and felt somewhat unpleasant to the touch. Silco chuckled softly. He found Linwen's behavior perplexing. Linwen possessed greater combat strength than Vander, yet he willingly followed Vander's order. Him and Vander weren't the same type of people, but Linwen still faithfully assisted Vander. "Hey? What does he want? What can Vander offer him? A little Piltover that's still under Piltover's control? Yet, when it comes to dealing with him, he has repeatedly disrupted his plans, but has never taken decisive action. This time, he's even proposed a collaboration himself. However, it's quite clear that Linwen's sincerity is lacking. To be clear, when Linwen asked for shimmer, Silco readily gave it to him. But now, Silco is simply looking to examine this shining source of light, and Linwen is reluctant. In response, Silco took a step forward and addressed Linwen, saying, "Are you asking me to go down there? If that's the case, Linwen, your sincerity doesn't seem quite enough." "Exactly, because I came here with sincerity, that's why I said no." "Silco, you just don't understand the power of this thing." Finally, Linwen said, "You want me to throw it to you? If I do, and you fail to catch it, you'll be in grave danger." Silco turned to Singed, hoping to obtain information about the shining stone from him. After all, he was entirely clueless when it came to science. The reason he ended up with Singed was an accident. Singed needed Shimmer to save something, and Silco just happened to need Shimmer to save something too, Zaun itself. For this purpose, the two of them formed an alliance. Silco provided the funds and Singed the expertise. However, the rights to use the Shimmer produced were owned by Silco. This plan had been in preparation for many years. The emergence of Shimmer 2.0 was all because of this guy, Linwen. Without him, Shimmer 1.0 would have been incredibly potent and usable. But in Linwen's presence, even this Shimmer 2.0 felt like a mere trinket. Silco was somewhat skeptical of Singed. Could this thing really become a weapon that posed a threat to Piltover? "Don't look at me, I have no idea what that is," Singed said, shaking his head. "You're a professor from up there, and that thing in his hand is clearly a gadget from Piltover. How can you not know?" Silco frowned. "I've been expelled from the academy, and new inventions come out of Piltover every day. Do you expect me to know what they all are? Hextech crystals, I've never even heard of them." Silco fell silent. Linwen waited for about 10 seconds before Silco turned and walked down the steps. Once Silco descended, Linwen approached him closely, leaving less than 2 meters between them. "Are you daring to get this close to me? Aren't you afraid I might snap you in two?" Linwen handed him the gem and teased him. From the fact that the Zaun underworld was scattered with the remnants of factories, it was clear that Silco was a cautious person. But now, he stood boldly in front of Linwen, whom Zaun's gangsters regarded as the most dangerous person in Zaun. Silco squinted his eyes, took the Hextech crystal from Linwen's hand, and held it up high. In the lamplight, he gently swayed it, examining the Hextech crystal intently. Silco spoke while studying it, "If you wanted to do that, I probably wouldn't be able to prevent it. But clearly, for some reason, whether it's because of Vander or your own choice, you don't intend to kill me." Silco placed the Hextech crystal in front of him and lightly tapped it with his other hand, and Linwen didn't stop him, as these small impacts wouldn't disrupt the internal structure of the Hextech crystal. Although he wasn't a genius in mechanics, Linwen had gained a good understanding of Hextech crystals during his week at the academy mingling with Jace and Victor. "We, actually, belong on the same side." Silco stowed the Hextech crystal away, clenched his hand into a fist, and said softly, "We are of the same kind." Linwen shrugged. Silco was trying to influence him again. This guy, Silco, was banking on the fact that Linwen didn't want to kill him. What's its purpose? Silco had to admit he couldn't understand the significance of this thing. To him, it was merely a pretty stone that glowed and had many dents. But Linwen came to him with this object, asking him to give up Shimmer, and suggesting they work together. Silco knew that this stone had to be something significant. "Maybe you can explain to him, his brain is having trouble comprehending this." Linwen pointed to Silco, hinting that he should hand the stone to Singed. Silco gave Linwen a deep stare. "Don't give me that look. Did I say something wrong?" "Ha," he chuckled and handed the Hextech crystal to Singed. He and Linwen stood aside, both watching Singed, who was holding the stone. Singed accepted the Hextech crystal. Although he found it strange that Silco and Linwen were standing aside, Singed was more interested in thoroughly researching the Hextech crystal. This object appeared to be extraordinary. Singed took a box from his pocket, put on a pair of glasses, and then started to study the Hextech crystal. After a few minutes, he mumbled while researching, "This thing has a very peculiar structure, highly unstable, and it's even hollow inside? Are these things sands from Shurima? Wait, the internal light, it should be some kind of energy." Listening to Singed's voice while standing nearby, Linwen couldn't help but marvel. Truly, Singed was a skilled alchemist. Although it was only surface-level information, it took Echo a whole night to piece together the simplest data. Yet Singed, in just a few minutes, saw the extraordinary nature of the Hextech crystal and even discovered its energy. Linwen placed his hand on Silco's shoulder, which greatly displeased the latter. Silco turned to look at Linwen's side profile for quite a while. He suddenly had an urge to spit in Linwen's face. But considering Linwen's combat prowess, Silco chose to just shrug his shoulder, shaking off Linwen's hand, and then took a couple of steps aside, tidying his collar. Petty, Linwen muttered and then said, "That's magic." Magic! Silco and Singed both exclaimed at the same time. "Do you realize what you just said?" Silco gave Linwen an incredulous look. He thought Linwen was just joking. Magic? Both Zaun and Piltover, while currently at odds, had a deep aversion to one thing: magic. No, let me correct that, it's actually arcane, Linwen quickly changed his words. It's not entirely correct to call it magic. According to Jace, who developed this technology, it was more aptly described as arcane tech than magic. It was all about utilizing one's knowledge, deducing patterns based on that knowledge, turning them into principles, and creating a force from them. This was the essence of Hextech technology. The Hextech technology Jace developed would later be referred to as arcane technology. It was essentially a human-made arcane power. Magic was something very different and not attainable by ordinary humans. Otherwise, how would one explain the creation of artificial Hextech crystals? Hextech was a human-made arcane cornerstone. For the term magic, it represented devilish sorcery, supernatural powers in the eyes of both Piltover and Zaun residents. What's the difference? Silco raised an eyebrow, speaking calmly. You're a hick. I can't be bothered explaining to you, Linwen retorted. Linwen turned his gaze to Singed. He may not understand, but you should, right? Singed remained silent for a moment, looking at the stone in his hand for a very long time. Then, he raised his head to Linwen and said, "Are you saying that Piltover can already manufacture tools for arcane magic?" Singed, are you acting foolish now, like him? Silco interjected. Magic tools. I've seen some of those things before, but they were all created by mages, non-human races as well. They called them relics. But from what you just said, this little thing can serve as a tool for human-made arcane magic. Singed clarified, seemingly intrigued. Yes, Linwen responded. Singed remained silent. Topside is heavily investing in Hextech technology now, and I've unexpectedly come across a few of these crystals, along with first-hand data. Singed. I need your help. Silco at the side. Chapter 29, Benzo of Zaun. Vander and his group were gone for 3 days, taking more than 70 people with them. When they returned, all of them were safe, but many had suffered injuries. Luckily, no one had died. Damn it, Vander, if it weren't for you punching that kid away, I might have lost this arm. That little bastard, I already let him go, and he dared to attack me from behind. All right, Benzo, you've repeated that 3 times already. Heck, can I not say it? I almost lost my arm. Vander, smoking a cigarette, smiled faintly and shook his head as he watched Benzo drinking heavily. Lowering his head, Vander looked at Powder, who was standing beside him, her large eyes filled with concern. Don't worry, I'm fine. There were still traces of fresh blood on his body, and many wounds, some from being hit with an iron bar and others from being slashed with a knife. Vander was injured quite severely. As the boss of the Undercity, he led the charge into battle. Interestingly, when many of the thugs saw that they had to face Vander, apart from the loyal followers of the Chem-Barons, most chose not to confront him. They were unwilling to fight against the father of Zaun. It's important to note that in the old Zaun, including the Undercity and even parts of the mid-level, many areas were under Vander's control. This is why Grayson got to know him and did business with him. Many of them had received Vander's kindness and protection. By the way, where's Linwen? Benzo asked Vander as he put down his glass. Vander patted Powder's head and then gave her a thorough rub. After this gesture, Powder finally relaxed and ran downstairs to find Six. Inside the Last Drop Tavern, the atmosphere was lively. The music player had changed from its usual nostalgic tunes to more cheerful songs. Vander looked at everyone celebrating and felt a sense of nostalgia. While the old days were calm, they often felt dull. But after Vander had a change of heart, the Undercity had come alive again. He's probably very busy right now, Vander replied. I heard that kid took care of the Black Ice Alliance and a few barons from the West District, Benzo said with a grin. Yeah, their surrender documents are right over there, Vander said, gesturing. He pouted and ended up with some foam from the drink on his mustache. Just like Benzo, Vander was in a great mood. He realized that he actually enjoyed fighting. Vander, look at you now. Your smile is so much brighter, Benzo said, his mouth wide with a grin. The foam on Vander's mustache made him look somewhat comical, but Benzo couldn't help but feel moved. He hadn't seen Vander this relaxed in a long time. Every time Vander came to visit him, he would vent his grievances and talk about the troublesome things Six and Powder had done, which gave him headaches. Ever since you adopted Six and Powder, you've been smiling but not as freely, Benzo said. He hesitated for a moment and added, it's not your fault, Vander. You don't have to carry a sense of guilt for them. You're wrong, Vander shook his head, swaying his drink. He smiled and said, they're my daughters. Even though they can be troublesome at times, I love them deeply. These were words he would never say to Six and Powder. Never. Vander had his pride, and he was the kind of father who struggled to express his emotions. So, he could only share these thoughts with his good friend, Benzo. Benzo blinked, and in the next moment, he picked up his glass, clinking it against Vander's. His large beard shook as he laughed. He looked at Vander and said, you're absolutely right. No matter how troublesome they get, it's our responsibility. What else could be more exasperating than having one children? Benzo asked with a wink, grinning widely, and downed his drink in one gulp. Of course there is, Vander replied with a smile, 2 children. Meanwhile, in a place unseen by Vander, a little figure was happily skipping down the stairs. Her steps were full of joy. Six isn't a burden to Vander, and she knows it. Because Six is strong, and she can help Vander. But she also believed that she wasn't a burden herself. She was his daughter. That's what Powder thought. Dash. The celebration at the tavern was in full swing, with people enjoying themselves. Suddenly, the tavern's entrance was pushed open, causing some annoyance among the patrons. Vander was taken aback too, wondering why they were open when he had posted a notice that the last drop was closed during these special times. Who would be foolish enough to push the tavern's door open at this moment? As Vander and the irritated Benzo saw the newcomer, their expressions shifted from surprise to smiles. Ha! Look who's back, brothers! Benzo stood up, his portly frame nudging through the people in front. He held his large cup close to Linwen and said with a loud laugh, it's the hero of the Black Ally. Benzo, how many drinks did you had? Linwen said, playfully pushing away the plump Benzo, whose breath smelled strongly of alcohol. At the bar, Vander raised his glass, wearing a warm smile, and loudly said, welcome back, Linwen. Linwen took a drink from the cup handed to him by someone nearby. After a hearty gulp, he stuck out his tongue and said, it wasn't too tough, just a few trips outside. But I've got something to tell you, A&D. Before Linwen could finish his sentence, the door that had just been closed was pushed open once more. This time, everyone turned to see who was coming in, and the room fell silent. Vander, who had been smiling, suddenly had a stern expression. He stared intently at the person who entered, giving off an aura like an angered lion. The tension in the air was palpable. A newcomer had entered, and he walked in with an air of elegance not typical of someone from Zaun. Interesting, he said, looking around. Black Ally is becoming poorer and more wretched. If this is the stability you desire, then I must say you're mistaken, brother. As all the eyes in the room fixated on him, Silco remained unfazed. He continued, what's this? You don't welcome me. Beside Linwen, a roar erupted. The drink that had just been filled splashed out as Benzo swung his cup at Silco. He yelled with intensity, Silco, you mother-f***er. You filthy piece of sh. I don't care if you crawled out of some stinking sewer, but I'm telling you, crawl right back to where you came from. Black Ally doesn't welcome you. Linwen. Oh my god. Linwen had no idea that Benzo could be so volatile. What a short fuse. Silco, on the other hand, knew Benzo all too well. You're just the same as ever, he said. You always show up to block the way when you shouldn't. Benzo couldn't keep his composure. He pointed at Silco, step by step, and shouted, F your mother. Chapter 30-30 Brother. See? I said we had to meet in private, but you didn't believe me. You thought you could calm him down. But now, how are you going to resolve this situation? Silco paid no direct attention to Benzo and remained calm on the surface. However, he clenched his fists tightly behind his back. If it were just Benzo talking like this to Silco, he would most likely end up as a miserable pawn floating down some waterway. But since they had agreed to cooperate and were on Vander's turf, Silco couldn't afford to lose his temper. He cast an annoyed glance at Linwen and said softly, "So you need to resolve this quickly, at least make him shut up. It won't be good for you, for me, or even for him if you don't." Silco had come to work with the Black Ally, not to pick fights. Being publicly berated by Benzo in front of so many was understandably infuriating. Linwen tried to restrain the agitated Benzo, but Benzo's anger flared up again upon hearing Silco's response. He bared his teeth and raged at Silco. "Silco, you damn dog of a traitor, what gives you the right to stand in front of me and speak so arrogantly? Resolve me? Make me shut up? Let me tell you right now, if you don't leave this place immediately, I will personally break your legs and send you off." Benzo turned to Linwen, shouting, "Linwen, don't try to stop me. I'm going to kill him myself." Silco's gaze grew colder by the moment. Linwen tried to restrain Benzo but found himself in a complex situation. Silco and Vander were brothers, and in theory, Benzo and Silco should have a similar bond. But looking at Benzo's hostile attitude towards Silco, it seemed to be more than just a simple grudge. Confronted by Silco's cold gaze, Linwen couldn't help but send a curious look his way. What on earth had this guy done during his time in the Black Ally, making the usually benevolent Vander, to expel him from the Black Ally? "All right, Benzo," Vander spoke up, attempting to defuse the situation. "Vander, you mustn't listen to this guy's nonsense. He can't say a few good words if his life depended on it," Benzo said, clearly irritated. "It's all right, he came with Linwen," Vander replied, lifting his hand and giving the order, "Sevika, have everyone leave." Sevika rose and nodded silently. Soon, the tavern emptied, leaving only Linwen, Benzo, Silco, and Vander, who had just emerged from behind the bar. Vander placed a large hand on Benzo's shoulder and shook his head. "Benzo, you should leave too. Are you out of your mind? What if he tries to attack you? Have you forgotten who caused your injuries? It was him." Benzo protested, his displeasure apparent. His animosity towards Silco was indeed substantial. Yet, in the past, he and Silco could sit at the same table, discussing their ideals while enjoying drinks. However, now, their relationship had become irreparably strained. In Benzo's eyes, Silco was no longer a Zaunite from the Black Ally, he had betrayed Vander, betrayed the Black Ally. If Silco knew Benzo's thoughts, he'd likely just sneer. Benzo's mind is as foolish as his appearance. A traitor? The real traitor is Vander. Vander has betrayed him, not the other way around. Go. Let's not think if Silco can pose a threat to me, plus, Linwen is still standing here. Vander insisted. Benzo had to consider the fact that Silco's physical strength wasn't much of a threat to him. He glared at Silco like a final warning and then said to Vander, "You be careful. Watch out for his tricks. He's the kind of guy who employs underhanded tactics." Linwen released Benzo, who left the premises with a final angry shove directed at Silco. After being pushed, Silco stumbled but quickly regained his balance. He simply patted the spot where Benzo had pushed him and remained silent. Once Benzo had left, the tavern was left with only 3 individuals. Silco and Vander exchanged a meaningful look. After a brief moment of hesitation, Vander finally spoke up. "Silco, why are you here?" Facing Vander's gaze, Silco spread his hands and began, "I've come to regain the respect I've lost, Vander. I've lost too much. What more respect do you need? I've already ensured the Black Ally gave you plenty of respect." "Silco, you shouldn't be so greedy," Vander responded. "I'm not seeking your respect," Silco replied, shaking his head in Vander's direction. He then pointed upwards and said to Vander, "I want their respect." Vander glanced at Linwen and frowned. "Did you tell him about our plans?" "Plans? That's funny. What kind of plan is that?" Without waiting for Linwen to speak, Silco took the lead. He gazed at Vander with an icy and stern expression, speaking forcefully. "You're making a grand display, taking your people into the Baron's territory for a big fight, and trying to unite all of Zaun. Is that your plan? Well, even if it is, what are you doing it for? To protect 2 insignificant little girls?" Silco replied sternly. "Mind your mouth, Silco," Vander warned as he heard Silco refer to his daughters as insignificant. His initial remorse towards Silco dissipated completely, and he approached Silco like a raging lion, containing his anger. However, Silco remained unfazed and continued, not to mention that even if you can get them all on the same side, what makes you think they'll actually follow your orders? You use force to suppress but show kindness to everyone, preserving goodwill. Vander, if loyalty were enough to succeed, we shouldn't have failed back then. Linwen stood on the side and found Silco's words quite reasonable. Silco was quite the master of persuasion. Vander, though, shook his head, saying, war will only. But he stopped halfway through his sentence. Silco immediately burst into laughter, pointing at Vander while addressing Linwen, you see, he's still the same. This is what you mean when you say that he had already figured it all out. Your actions have already begun, and you're halfway there, yet he remains indecisive. Silco shoved Vander with both hands and exclaimed, Vander, when will you change this habit of wanting to take back arrows that have already been fired? It's laughable. When we were on the bridge back then, if you hadn't stopped us, we would have charged across that bridge. But what about all those who died? Silco, what about those Zaunites who lost their lives? Not to mention that getting across the bridge doesn't mean we would have succeeded. That is what they wanted. They followed us to cross the bridge and they were ready for the worst, but you, as the leader, halted the operation halfway. You thought your decision saved the remaining half of the Black Ally, but it was you who got scared. You harbored those kids out of guilt for their lost parents, but you're the real cause of their suffering. Because of your decision, the people who followed us all died in vain. Our carefully planned operation ended up with nothing, and Zaun remains Zaun, Piltover remains Piltover. And you hide in the Undercity, thinking you can trade with topsiders for their pity. Peace obtained through begging is just a fragile piece of paper, and it can be torn apart with a thought, Vander. Wake up. You can test me, challenge me, I don't care. But you can't abandon me. Silco advanced, pointing accusingly at Vander, who was still reeling from his outburst. Vander slumped against the bar, hands on his head, unable to speak. I've never betrayed, never. The one who betrayed Zaun isn't me, it's you. Silco pointed fiercely at Vander's chest, continuing, there was a time when we shared the same vision? We both dreamt of freedom for Zaun, Vander. His words left Vander breathless. Had he been atoning for his own mistakes all these years? He'd been educating Six, using his past wrongs, and trying to guide her. But there was one thing that had always been right. There could be no more death. At that moment, a hand reached out and grabbed Silco's shoulder, calming him down. Linwen sighed and then forcefully pushed Silco backward, toppling him over the table and spilling several bottles of alcohol. The tavern fell silent. In a moment, Silco was on his feet, wet and drenched. He ran his fingers through his hair, formed a top knot, and held his wounded hand to his mouth. He closed his eyes, drinking the blood-mixed alcohol, and then looked at Linwen. Linwen stared back at him. Silco's words included some of what Linwen had said to Vander before, but part of it conflicted with his own thoughts. Linwen sighed inwardly. Silco and Vander, these two men could both be right. As Linwen had considered earlier, if their personalities complemented each other, they could truly be the fathers of Zaun. Vander had become a dove after witnessing the cruelty of war, and Silco became even more firmly entrenched as a hawk after witnessing the brutality. One was too soft, and the other was too hard. Bringing you here wasn't meant for you to vent your frustrations, Linwen told Silco, annoyed. It's necessary to vent, if I don't let it out, it's tough for me to cooperate with him, Silco said calmly, rolling up his sleeves and looking at Linwen with a calm face. It was as if Linwen hadn't thrown him out a moment ago. But I was indeed rude, I apologize, Silco said, then walked past Linwen and approached Vander. We once had a same dream, brother. I must say I've resented you at times, but I've always respected you. Until you joined forces with the topsiders, became their lapdog, and seemed to forget all the hardships we've been through. But now, it seems like you're awake, so perhaps we have a chance to move forward together again, don't we? Silco, changing his earlier frenzy, spoke calmly. He extended his hand, offering it to Vander. Brother. Chapter 31 Shimmer? Not at all. Hatred can either deepen over time or slowly dissipate. Silco and Vander, these former brothers, today, they have finally sat down together once again. Holding Silco's outstretched hand, Vander spoke in a deep voice, in any case, we need to talk. The conversation between Silco and Vander continued until nightfall. During this time, Linwen sat silently between the two of them, serving as a well-behaved mascot. Linwen listened attentively, and as the discussion progressed, he could even craft a little story from Silco and Vander's conversation. The story was quite simple and not as complicated as Linwen had initially thought. Silco wasn't the villain Linwen had imagined him to be, and the reason Benzo treated him with such an attitude was probably more about Benzo's own personality. In summary, Vander wronged Silco first, and Silco made his mistakes later. The two of them had differing philosophies. However, Silco still respected Vander and hoped to bring him back into the fold, while Vander rejected Silco's more aggressive ideas and wanted a stable development for the Black Ally. But after Linwen's appearance, Vander began to change. He wasn't convinced by Linwen, he was impressed by Linwen. Everyone in the Black Ally now believed that Linwen could lead them well because he was simply too strong. As for Silco, he, like Vander, was also won over by Linwen's strength. After talking it out, they realized that there wasn't as much hatred between them as they thought. After all, they were once like brothers. So, shall we leave it at that for today? Linwen let out a big yawn. He hadn't had much sleep in the past 3 days, and now that he finally had some downtime, he was feeling quite tired. These past few days had involved a lot of running around the Undercity, and Linwen felt like a brick, similar to the week he spent in the Upper City. The only difference was that in the Upper City, he had a nice little room, good food and drinks, and a soft, comfy bed. The treatment, well, it was no wonder that the Zaunites envied and admired the lifestyle of the Upper City. Silco stood up when he heard Linwen's words. He looked at Vander and remained silent for a long time before finally saying, "Then I'll come back next time." Vander hesitated for a moment, stood up, and looked at Silco. He said, "Silco, you can move back to the Black Ally. Since we're planning to build a new Zaun together, trust is essential." Silco was momentarily taken aback, and he remained silent for a very long time. It was only after Vander began to wonder if he had said something wrong that Silco let out a deep breath and sighed, "Do you know how long I've been waiting for you to say that? My time has been frozen since that day, but today, it has started moving again." Silco continued, smiling, "But let's forget it. I can't get used to living in the Black Ally anymore." Silco then looked at Linwen, who was dozing off in the lamplight, and extended his hand to snap his fingers in front of Linwen. He said loudly, "Linwen, I'll continue to develop Shimmer, but I can promise you that in the future, the Shimmer sold in Zaun will only be Shimmer with the side effects removed. Well, it's unlikely to completely eliminate them." "Silco, now that we have Hextech technology, do we even need Shimmer?" Linwen furrowed his brow, and Shimmer didn't sit well with his senses. While it was powerful, it posed risks to the human body and had severe addictive qualities. "Do you know why I named it Shimmer?" Silco walked to the front door of the Last Drop Tavern, placed his hand on the door handle, and turned back to Linwen to explain, "It's called Shimmer because it's a faint but hopeful light. It's not just what you see now, Linwen. It also has strong healing effects that you haven't seen yet. Today's Shimmer 2.0 has already made some progress. Although there is some pain after consumption, diluted Shimmer can perfectly treat life-threatening knife and gunshot wounds. Isn't that beautiful? Linwen. Are you sure about this? You're telling me that this messed up concoction can still be used as medicine?" Linwen obviously found this hard to believe. "Take a 2.0 for now, and when the 3.0 is ready, you can try that one too," Silco said, touching a small vial containing a dark purple liquid and placing it on the nearby table. He then smiled and walked out of the tavern. As for why Silco himself brought this to the Black Ally, well, that didn't need much explanation, did it? Outside the door of the Fumigator's tavern, there were a few burly men guarding Silco, and they initially gave Vander an unfriendly look. But then, they nodded to Linwen, who was standing beside Vander. The reason they were rude to Vander was that they didn't believe in his decision as Zaunites. In their eyes, Vander's path was a dead end, and Silco was the future of Zaun. As for why they nodded to Linwen, well, there wasn't much to say. They were scared. "Seems like they don't like me," Vander said, somewhat surprised. "Of course, when the two of us stand together, it's easy to see who's more popular," Linwen said as he walked over to pick up the vial Silco had left behind, and when he tried to grab it, he nearly dropped Silco's Shimmer 2.0. The reason he had this reaction was that the data he received left him speechless. Corrupting potion, incomplete, consumable. Quality. Effect: after consumption, it will increase strength by 12 points and agility by 7 points. It also provides 2 points of stamina recovery per second, lasting for 12 seconds. Side effects: this is an unrefined corrupting potion. While it has the effect of increasing strength and recovering minor injuries, it also comes with the drawbacks of hallucinations and addiction, as well as a slight impact on the intelligence of the user. Vander, Linwen said, holding the corrupting potion. No, it was Silco and Singed Shimmer with a smile on his face, a somewhat bitter and frightened smile. How could Linwen not know about the corrupting potion? Originally, when he heard that Silco had come up with Shimmer 2.0, Linwen didn't have much of a reaction. It wasn't surprising for alchemical technology to produce something like this. However, when he found out it was the corrupting potion, Linwen started to question life itself. This early game god item, the potency of a mix suitable for mages and top lane tanks, how could Linwen not know about it? With this realization, Linwen suddenly figured it all out. No wonder when he was in Fiden's place, the monsters he'd cut off their arms with his sword grew back flesh buds where their limbs had been when Linwen was about to leave. Does Shimmer have the ability to regenerate severed limbs? If Singed can develop Shimmer 3.0 in 2 years, then maybe it won't be weaker than the Hextech technology developed by Jace. After all, is Silco the type of person who lags behind? If it weren't for Linwen, this guy might have already been spreading Shimmer everywhere. He's undoubtedly capable of posing a threat to Piltover. He's formidable, and of course, I know that, Vander shrugged, thinking that Linwen was exaggerating. How could Silco be more formidable than him? No, you don't understand, Vander. Silco's prowess is truly beyond our imagination. This little thing I have in my hand could genuinely threaten Piltover, Linwen said, holding Shimmer, and continued, it can create something potentially more powerful than you. Linwen paused, and he suddenly realized that if it was still Shimmer 1.0, the monsters it created, depending on the user's physical strength, should have an average value less than Vander. They were mostly just brain dead after consuming it. But with Shimmer 2.0, Linwen had noticed during the fight with Fiden that the users of 2.0 had self-awareness. They knew exactly what they were doing at the time, even if they suffered brain damage afterward, that was a later consequence. Plus, the new Shimmer could increase strength by 4 points and agility by 2, along with its injury recovery effect. It was far stronger than what Linwen had seen a month ago. Imagine if it was just Shimmer 1.0, the creatures it created would be less potent than Vander on average, but they'd be pretty much brain dead due to the intense side effects. However, with the Shimmer 2.0, Linwen had observed during the fight in Fiden that the users could maintain their self-awareness and cognitive abilities. The new Shimmer was vastly more potent than what he'd seen a month ago. It was enticing. But only a little bit, as Linwen realized that the healing effect of Shimmer 2.0, on closer inspection, wasn't that significant. It was akin to a game. Linwen was already in level 18 tank, did he need Shimmer at that point? This world wasn't a game world, it was real. Shimmer might be beneficial for ordinary people, but it was useless for the strong. If Linwen gave this stuff to the likes of Ornn, Anivia, and others, to enhance their attributes and recover from injuries? Haha. Looking at Vander, Linwen continued, it's definitely more powerful than you. Imagine if we had thousands of you charging the bridge together back then. Could the Piltover enforcers really have stopped you? Linwen asked Vander. Vander thought for a moment, then raised his head and said, they could hold their ground. They have guns, men. But could they be unafraid of death, and could they regenerate severed limbs? Vander fell silent, disbelief in his eyes, but Linwen nodded firmly. And, Vander, this thing from a month ago isn't as powerful as it is now, Linwen said, shaking his head in disappointment. Singed is still developing 3.0, and there could even be 4.0 and 5.0 in the future. Who is Singed? Vander asked. He's a formidable guy, someone who can stand on equal footings with Professor Heimerdinger. Vander was shocked, someone like that came down to Zaun. Linwen didn't reply, holding the potion in his hand, filled with anticipation. Just imagine Zaunites wielding Hextech technology and Shimmer going to negotiate with the councilors. At that time, would they still be able to ignore the voices of Zaunites? Could they still ignore the suffering of the Zaunites after witnessing the power of Zaun? This was the power of technology. This was the alchemical technology that belonged to Zaun. To be honest, this should not be my confusion. Shimmer and the corrupting potion are incredibly similar. Both are purple, and both enhance attributes and have regenerative properties. The corrupting potion enhances damage, while Shimmer goes even further, efficiently healing wounds with a single drop. It's almost like a miraculous potion. From this, it's clear, corrupting potion is Shimmer. Chapter 32. Let's wait and see. Linwen gathered the Shimmer and looked at the somewhat shaken Vander. He greeted him, you just stay here. I'll go check on Powder and Six. Vander waved his hand, indicating Linwen was free to go. To Vander, Linwen was like his child, just as much a part of Black Alley as any other resident. He wondered what would have happened if Zoran hadn't taken Linwen in first. In his mind, Linwen was another one of Black Alley's children and a remarkably gifted one. Vander sipped his drink and reflected on the events of the past few days. He had returned to the life of a mobster, wearing his brass knuckles, leading fights against various barons. The most surprising thing was that he had thought he would never sit at the same table with Silco again, but just now, they had shared the same drink and talked about the same ideals. It felt like they were standing together once more, just like old times. This made Vander feel a wave of nostalgia. Meanwhile, Linwen headed down to the basement. He saw the small door ajar, with dim lights shining through and the aroma of food filling the air. Did Six and Powder make something to eat at this hour? Linwen smacked his forehead in realization. He had been so engrossed in the conversation with Silco and Vander that he had forgotten all about the two youngsters in the basement. They must be starving by now. Linwen pushed open the door and found Six and Powder huddled around a small pot under the warm glow of a lamp. Linwen. Upon seeing Linwen, Powder excitedly opened her arms and called out. What are you guys doing? Linwen leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees, and asked Six and Powder. The thing you see right now cooking. Six pouted and added with a hint of emotion, you've been chatting with Vander and someone for so long, did you forget that Powder and I were down here? How could I? Linwen ruffled Powder's hair with his big hand and grinned, saying, of course I remember you and Powder are down here. Didn't you come up to eavesdrop on our conversation in the meantime? No, I didn't eavesdrop. Six's face turned red, and she hurriedly explained, I wouldn't eavesdrop on grown-up stuff. I just wanted to ask Vander to cook, but when I saw you talking, I waited, thinking you'd be done soon. But that's not what you told me. Powder tilted her head, looking at Six, throwing her sister under the bus. Shut up, Powder. Six shifted to make room for Linwen, pouting, and he sat between Six and Powder. He peered into the small pot. Did you make this? Of course, Powder doesn't cook, Six proudly replied. I'll learn to cook in the future. The two sisters started a little argument, but Six would quickly give in. She always spoiled and teased Powder. And Linwen teased and spoiled her in return. Do you know how to clean fish this time? I'm not a dummy. Give me a portion too. Linwen playfully reached into his backpack and pulled out 2 adult-sized pieces of bread when his hand came out. Yay! Powder immediately clapped her hands and took the bread from Linwen. She couldn't wait and took a bite. She was indeed starving, and Six was too. And Six's table manners were even worse than Powder's. Take it easy and eat. There's no one here to steal it from you, Linwen said, looking at the two girls in amusement. Watching Six and Powder battle with their bread, Linwen shook his head, skillfully went to the area that's used to store stuff, took out 3 small bowls and wiped them clean. Then, he grabbed a ladle. He filled 3 bowls with fish soup, placed them on the ground, and the 3 of them sat around the pot to enjoy their dinner. Linwen, tell me the truth. Are we going to war? Suddenly, Six patted Linwen, and breadcrumbs stuck to his arm. He looked at Six, exasperated. Where did you hear that? Who told you we're going to war? You've been going to fight every day these past few days. Silly girl, that's just fighting. Do you even know what a war is? Zaun's gang fights can hardly be called a war, especially when you consider what a war is like in Nakuz. The commotion in the depths of Zaun can't really be called a war. At best, it's gang skirmishes. The most it would do is make the Pilties raise an eyebrow or two. What about fighting Piltover? That's a war, isn't it? Six held her bowl, her face flushed from the steam, squinting her eyes. Despite always trying to look tough, the occasional display of cuteness made her even more endearing. She kept asking Linwen, can I go when it happens? I can fight a lot of Pilties, and I'm not afraid of getting hurt. Hearing Six say that, Powder quickly set down her bowl, wiped her mouth, and loudly said, Linwen, I'm not afraid either. Take me with you. I've made lots of nail bombs, I can definitely help you. Who told you we're going to fight Piltover? Linwen rolled his eyes and lightly pushed Six away as she approached. After returning to the Last Drop Tavern, Six changed her clothes, took a shower, and, in addition to being under Vander and Linwen's forced house arrest these past few days, she was clean. It was a stark contrast to her usual dirty and blood-stained appearance. Now, if you were to dress her in the dresses that the Piltover girls liked, tidy up her messy hair, she would undoubtedly be the most beautiful girl in all of Zaun. Unlike Powder, little Powder still has some baby teeth left. Adorable as she is, she's still in the stage of not growing up yet. Wait a minute, isn't Powder always going to be like that in the future? Linwen got lost in thought. You and Vander both said, and that other person said too, that to make Piltover realize our strength, we need to first develop technology and create weapons. And you said you didn't eavesdrop on our conversation. That doesn't matter, you tell me first, are we going to fight Piltover? Six rubbed her hands together, extremely excited. Her dissatisfaction with Piltover had long filled her chest. You can't fight them, silly. Linwen explained, Vander and I have been subduing chem barons from various places these past few days, and we've been successful. It's clear that all the things I've been doing in the Undercity weren't in vain. They're all scared of me. Whenever I step. Linwen slowly lowered his head and saw Powder's small hand on top of his. Linwen's hand wasn't particularly large, but compared to Powder's, it was several times bigger. Powder looked up at him and said, They're scared of you? Why? Which part of you is scary? It's only you who would dare say that. Six, who was often scolded by Linwen, mumbled to herself while looking at Powder. Is Linwen scary? He's super scary. Milo and Clagger can testify to that. When Linwen gets angry, he's like a demon, even though it was to protect them. But for Powder, Linwen is one of her favorite people. Because Linwen has never scolded Powder, not once. For you, it might be like that, but for them, I think I should be a devil. Linwen felt somewhat comforted. Powder's inadvertent little gesture seemed to be consoling him. Well, these years of doting on her were not in vain. That's only because they did something wrong. You're not a devil, and you're not allowed to call yourself that. Powder patted Linwen's hand forcefully. If you're a devil, then I'm a devil too. I'm a little devil. As she said that, she started to laugh, as if she found the idea amusing. The big devil Linwen, with the medium devil Six, and Six holding the little devil Powder. Ha! That must be quite amusing. You're not a little devil, you're a little silly. Linwen reached out to gently pat Powder's little nose, feeling relaxed. In any case, we won't go to war with Piltover, Six, because what we want to do isn't to attack Piltover but to make Zaun independent. What's the difference? Zaun wants independence, so don't we have to fight Piltover? Six didn't understand. Considering Piltover's long-standing control and deep discrimination against Zaun, it would be a miracle if Piltover agreed to Zaun's independence. They won't agree to our independence. Linwen smiled mysteriously and gazed at the ceiling, stretching his arms back and supporting himself on the ground. They will agree. They definitely will. Let's wait and see. Chapter 33 A Promise. The night was already deep, and various parts of Zaun should be in chaos. Gangs and criminals would be operating in the dark, smugglers and profiteers would be doing their best to make money. But all of this might be happening in various corners of the Undercity, certainly not in the Black Alley. Ever since Linwen gained his reputation 3 years ago and established this rule in Vander's name, all the gangs in Zaun knew one thing: if you wanted to do business in the Black Alley, that was perfectly fine, as long as you were there for legitimate business. The Black Alley welcomed you in broad daylight, but you were strictly forbidden from entering at night to avoid causing disturbances. In Zaun, no one dared to violate this rule, not even prominent merchants from other regions who came to Zaun. They all adhered to this regulation. Now, in the upper and underground floors of the Last Drop Tavern, apart from the soothing music and the sound of Vander's footsteps, along with the clinking of bottles as he placed them on the table, the other sound came from Linwen in the basement. At this moment, Linwen was holding a storybook in his hands, sitting on a tattered old sofa. He was telling stories to Powder, and even though she had heard Linwen's stories many times before, she still loved it when he told her these stories. After finishing a fairy tale story about Shurima legends, Linwen took a sip of water and lowered his head. Powder's little face was right in front of him, the back of her head resting on Linwen's chest, her little head tilted back, her eyes half closed, drowsiness washing over the little girl. Linwen estimated the time, it should be around 11 o'clock at night now. For a 10-year-old like Powder, this time was already very late. At this time in the past, both Six and Powder would already be asleep, but tonight, Powder clung to Linwen and kept dragging it out, and it became late into the night. Linwen carefully lifted Powder from his embrace and walked towards her bed. He gently placed her on the bed and sighed with relief. However, his relief was short-lived because Powder on the bed suddenly furrowed her brows, extended her little hand, and tugged on Linwen's shirt, unwilling to let go. Linwen was in a dilemma. How should he handle this? Should he just pull her hand away? No, it was clear that she hadn't entered deep sleep yet. If he caused a disturbance, she might wake up, and then he would have to put her back to sleep, right? Both Powder and Linwen were tired, and he hadn't slept for several days. With no other choice, Linwen stood by the bed while Six approached him, whispering softly in his ear, "Are you going to the upper city tomorrow?" Linwen's shirt was being tugged by Powder, and he could only stand there. Looking at Six, he replied quietly, "I probably won't be gone for too long, but it might be a month or two." "Is it for work?" Six sniffed, noticing Linwen's eye movement and the subtle hand-rubbing gesture. Knowing Linwen well, Six immediately extended her hand, took a step forward, and stood on her tiptoes in front of Linwen. Then she pointed her finger at the tip of Linwen's nose, her tone somewhat upset as she said, "You're not allowed to deceive me. You rubbed your index finger and thumb, and your eyes were shifting around. Tell me, are you trying to deceive me again?" Linwen was taken aback. How did she know? "I've noticed this habit of yours for a long time, Linwen. You always do this when you're about to deceive someone." Seeing Linwen's surprised expression, Six became quite pleased with herself. She tilted her little face upward, gazing at Linwen, "You can just tell me directly. I won't pester you, and neither will Powder. I just don't want you to lie to me again." Linwen had only been in Piltover for a week this time and back in Zaun for just 3 days, but he would be leaving again tomorrow. "Shh." Linwen immediately made a hushing gesture as he began to speak. Powder's little hand, which was clutching his shirt, loosened, and she turned over in bed, sprawling out with a big yawn. Powder's mouth opened wide, and she had already fallen into a peaceful slumber. Children have the enviable ability to sleep soundly. When they feel tired, they can simply lie down and fall asleep. Seeing this, both Linwen and Six couldn't help but smile wryly at the scene. Once they were sure that Powder was fast asleep, Linwen turned to Six with a sense of reflection. Unconsciously, he had grown taller over the years, now towering over the older Zoran. And both Six and Powder had also grown. Linwen looked at Six, his gaze softening, and he began to speak, "Me, Vander, and Silco, the man you saw this afternoon, have made a pact. Zaun wants independence, but to achieve that, we need weapons. Considering Zaun's current condition, it's difficult to produce weapons that would make Piltover take us seriously. Silco is working on developing his concoctions. We want Vander to become the true leader of Zaun. As for me, Six, my task is to find weapons that can make Piltover wary. But do you have to find these weapons in Piltover? Of course. It's the city of progress, a city that geniuses from all over the world admire. No matter how much we dislike Piltover, we can't deny its value and status." Linwen looked at Six and continued earnestly, "And, listen to me, Six, there might come a time when we have to fight Piltover, but that's just fighting, not a war. But people will still die. If there are casualties, doesn't that count as a war? That's why we need powerful weapons. To prevent the deaths of innocent people and make sure we have something substantial to negotiate with Piltover." In reality, there were certain things Linwen couldn't reveal to Six. During the morning conversation with Silco and Vander, Silco expressed his dissatisfaction multiple times because Linwen and Vander were both against launching a full-scale assault on Piltover. The strength of Piltover was undeniable. Even if every Zaunite used Shimmer to fight Piltover, the result would likely be mutually devastating, and Zaun would suffer more. Fortunately, despite being a hardliner, Silco was aware that launching a full-scale attack on Piltover would be a fool's errand. If Piltover was truly pushed to the edge, they could send a squad of enforcers on airships to drop explosives into the Undercity's chasms. In such a situation, Zaun would be helpless. Furthermore, suppose Linwen indeed possessed the power to destroy Piltover. In that case, he still couldn't do it, because someone would intervene. Jana. She would never consent to Piltover's destruction, as both Zaun and Piltover were like her children. She now favored Zaun a bit more because it was like the older sister who had been mistreated, while the younger sister continued to bully the elder one. Naturally, Jana had to support the older sister, Zaun. Anyway, Six sighed, shaking her head, and reached out with a single finger. She looked at Linwen with utmost seriousness and said, I don't understand all that stuff you're talking about. But you have to promise me you'll come back to Zaun on Progress Day. We haven't had a proper Progress Day celebration for 2 years, Linwen said, pausing for a moment. Then he reached out and hooked his finger with Six. I promise, he declared. On Progress Day, I'll bring back a bunch of presents. You said it yourself, don't forget. Of course, my little sister. Chapter 34 Zevi. University of Piltover. A new week had begun in this renowned institution, located in the City of Progress, known for gathering geniuses from all over Piltover. From the early morning, the sound of constant explosions echoed from within the university. However, for the students, teaching assistants, and professors passing by, this was nothing out of the ordinary. After all, Piltover University was not only rich in academic atmosphere, but even the scent of gunpowder was part of its daily life. Science and progress, these two words always seemed to take a step forward accompanied by explosions. They were as if bound together. Outside a laboratory with a nameplate and a designated owner, if you happened to pass by, you would likely hear furious shouts from inside. No, this won't work. This is not how it's supposed to be done. You have to attach this first and then modify the energy transfer method. We need smaller energy to pass through. Victor, you understand what I mean? They can't grasp it, but you certainly can. Jace, they can understand you, but you have to explain clearly. You can't always tell them with this or that approach. You need to give them detailed step-by-step instructions. They are not like us, they have only recently started working with Hextech. You have to give them time to get familiar and adjust. Who has the time to let them adapt? If it works, it works, if not, they shouldn't come to cause trouble. Enough. The time you don't have to spare is holding back our experiments. Jace, this isn't something that the two of us can solve. We need more people to help us. Are you planning to do all the precise assembly yourself? We've already wasted too much useless time. The two young men, close in age, engaged in a heated argument, making the people around them feel somewhat embarrassed. One was reprimanding them while the other was speaking in their defense. However, amidst this group of people, there were two exceptions. One looked like a big yellow toy at first glance, while the other was a dark-haired, fair-faced boy. These two individuals sat next to each other with cheerful expressions, sipping fine tea and enjoying exquisite pastries. They occasionally listened to the heated arguments happening around them, but soon returned to their own conversation. Linwen, is Zaun really as you describe it? Of course, Professor. That's why the people of Zaun resent those from Piltover. However, if you can create an air purification device that filters out toxic gases, it might help improve the relationship between the two cities. Someone was being optimistic, but Zaun's scientists had considered making such filtration devices. Even that young fellow Echo had attempted to create one. The problem was, they didn't have the funds. Zaun was genuinely impoverished. Now that Vander had unified most of Zaun under his rule, his word practically represented the entire city, but what did that change? They were still impoverished. As an upright man, Vander wouldn't allow human trafficking, drug sales, or forced sexual transactions in his territory. However, these three had always been a significant source of income for Chem barons. Besides the barons who profited from elixirs and equipment, most of Zaun's underworld depended on these activities to earn money. Now, Vander not only refrained from taking action himself, but he also cut off their sources of income. Ha, so it's us being poor together, isn't it? The reason Silco likely doesn't support Vander is probably for this reason. If Vander takes over Zaun, the gap with Piltover will only widen. Thankfully, Linwen is here, otherwise, Silco would have left to pursue his own interests. In truth, creating a filtration device is a straightforward task. But making one that can filter out such concentrated toxic gases, haze, wastewater laden with metallic residues, and more is exceedingly difficult. Materials, energy, the craft of manufacture, and the range of applications, there are man-of-challenges. In short, creating it is incredibly tough. Listening to Linwen's words, Heimerdinger stroked his beard and raised his big eyes. He looked at Linwen and said, I can give it a try, but I can't guarantee I can make it. This idea of filtration devices for Zaun has been brought up before, I remember that, but it was eventually rejected by a councilman. However, I can try to find his blueprints. Those ideas should be stored in the university's archive. Linwen nodded with a contented smile and took a big sip of his tea. He had been in Piltover for 4 days now, but he started working from day 1. He was assisting Jace and Victor with their research while seeking things beneficial to Zaun from Piltover. To be clear, just about anything tossed from Piltover University was a valuable treasure for the people of Zaun. For instance, there was an automatic fish-catching machine designed by a Piltover student several years ago. With a simple power source, it could run for an entire day and catch over 800 pounds of fish. Jace and Victor appearing in the game didn't mean they were the 2 most brilliant individuals. When it came to genius, the entirety of Piltover University was filled with them. This fact made Linwen, who once considered himself a small genius, feel deeply inferior. The intellectual gap was truly insurmountable. Besides, Professor, I have another brilliant idea, but I need someone with exceptional manufacturing skills to assist. Heimerdinger turned to Linwen and inquired, Hey? Jace and Victor aren't up to the task? They're among the brightest individuals in the university. No, Jace and Victor can only achieve tolerances of 0.05 mm, but I need someone who can work on materials below 0.05 mm, and what they'd be machining is hextech crystals. Ah, I believe I can do that. Heimerdinger proudly stood up and patted his chest. Linwen chuckled and said, Can you help me with this, Professor? Of course, no problem, my boy. You've helped me so much, I must return the favor. But how long will this little project of yours take me? Preliminary estimation, Professor, I'll need you for several months, maybe even a few years. Do you have that kind of time? Linwen said with a smile. Of course, he knew that Heimerdinger was more than capable. As Jace and Victor's teacher, Heimerdinger had an exceptional skill set. Do you know Heimerdinger's full title? The revered inventor. There might not be a scientist alive more brilliant than Heimerdinger. But hearing Linwen's words, Heimerdinger blinked his large eyes, and then he stood there fidgeting and hesitating, not saying anything. Linwen, in turn, was delighted. He really enjoyed being with science enthusiasts. Because Professor Heimerdinger was a very interesting and innocent person. Just like now, Heimerdinger found himself in an embarrassing situation for stating of course earlier but now being unable to assist Linwen. This surprised Linwen quite a bit. After all, even though he had become good friends with Jace, Jace consciously avoided Linwen's Zaunite background. He wouldn't do the same with Victor. Probably because Victor could keep up with his intellect, and Linwen wasn't as clever as Jace. So, in Jace's eyes, Victor wasn't considered a Zaunite because he was intelligent, while Linwen was still a Zaunite because he was stupid. Jace was quite arrogant, conceited, and looked down on anyone less intelligent than him. But really, how many people in this world are smarter than you? In front of him, Heimerdinger took a couple of steps forward, clasped his hands together, and apologized, I'm sorry, child. As a councilman. It's all right, Professor, Linwen shook his head. My invention isn't that important, and, besides, it's just an undeveloped idea. Heimerdinger nodded. Linwen picked up the teapot, poured more tea for Heimerdinger, and then, after a brief moment of silence, the grand inventor suddenly clapped his hands and exclaimed, I've got it. Heimerdinger called out loudly, You can go find Zevi. She's an unparalleled genius. Heimerdinger continued, She's the finest mechanical engineer at Piltover's University. Processing materials with a precision of 0.05 mm is undoubtedly within her capabilities. What? Linwen, who initially didn't have much hope and mentioned it casually, was left wide-eyed. Then Heimerdinger took hold of Linwen's pant leg. Full of confidence, Heimerdinger raised his head and said, Come, my boy, I'll take you to meet her. Chapter 35 Zevi Retta. Linwen was tugged along by Heimerdinger, stumbling and wearing an expression that was a mix of amusement and bemusement. Heimerdinger was a pure scientist. In his world, matters like fame, power, status, and wealth were unimportant. What mattered most was the thirst for knowledge and the desire to inspire and help those students who were lost. In the current situation, he saw Linwen as a student in need of his guidance. A lost lamb in need of guidance, Heimerdinger played this role at Piltover's university. Heimerdinger's contributions to Piltover's success were undeniable, and that's why people in Piltover called him father while he was still alive. Believe me, Linwen, Zivi may have some minor character quirks, but her technical skills are beyond doubt. In the field of mechanics, she is the most genius person I've ever seen in all of history. Do you truly hold her in such high regard, Professor? Are you suggesting that she might be even more talented than Jace and Victor? Linwen was somewhat skeptical of Heimerdinger's words. Heimerdinger, or rather, the Yordles, always seemed a bit quirky. Looking at their background stories, Yordles appeared to be inherently simple. They possessed an insatiable curiosity and approached everything with a positive attitude, even in matters of praise. The likes of Heimerdinger, Lulu, Corky, and Tristana often used overly exaggerated expressions when complimenting someone. Linwen remembered watching a video before coming here, titled "Don't Mess with Yordles." In it, Tristana, when seeing Graves' cannon pointed at her face, didn't react with fear but rather excitement. She exclaimed, "Whoa, a double cannon!" It wasn't until Graves fired a shot past her, that Tristana awkwardly pulled her hand back. Linwen realized that one should only take half of what Yordles said seriously, their thought processes were entirely different from normal people. Indeed, Piltover's university was a haven of geniuses. Grabbing any random individual from the university would guarantee an IQ well over 100. But when it came to being more talented than Jace and Victor, Linwen thought it was a tough bar to reach. For someone not to be overshadowed by Jace and Victor was already an extraordinary feat. To be compared to them and leave a mark in history, well, that was something else. But Zivi? Linwen couldn't recall ever hearing that name before. Each person has their own strengths, my child. Jace's craftsmanship isn't all that impressive when it comes to traditional craftsmanship. To see a master at traditional craftsmanship, you'd have to look at our chief mechanist here in the academy, Zivi. As for Victor, he can certainly handle the finer aspects of machining, but his health isn't that great, he always needs a break after working for a while. Heimerdinger released Linwen's trouser leg and led the way with small but determined strides. His custom-made small-sized boots made a crisp tap-tap-tap sound as he walked, and he had a compact, rhythmic gait. But this is also quite amusing. Linwen looked down at the Yordle walking beside him and asked, "But Professor, are you sure she's willing to help me? After all, I don't have money, and I'm not sure if my little idea can earn any." "Don't worry, my child. Zivi doesn't lack money, she received more investment from big families than Jace and Victor." "Well, wait, maybe it's more for Jace and Victor now? After all, Hextech technology is a groundbreaking invention." Linwen nodded and didn't decline the professor's offer any further. He smiled and said, "I appreciate your help, Professor. Leave it to me, my boy." Heimerdinger fluffed his mustache and stepped lively. A dozen minutes later, Linwen followed Heimerdinger to another part of the academy. He had been here before, helping Professor Heimerdinger move laboratory equipment. This area belonged to the School of Mechanical Engineering, while Victor and Jace worked in the School of Natural Sciences. Their research on Hextech technology represented a new and uncertain direction, with nobody knowing what the future held for Hextech technology. "Linwen, listen to me. Zivi has a somewhat quirky temperament, so be prepared when you meet her." Standing in front of a door, Linwen raised his head to check the nameplate, which displayed elegant lettering. "Zivi's personal quarters. Do not enter. Leave deliveries by the door. For matters requiring attention, please come back after evening. In case of emergency, knock on the door. Do not enter directly, or face the consequences." "I understand. Geniuses always have their quirks. Jace's arrogance, Victor's obsession, those traits that make you so generous with praise can also lead to peculiarities." "Your summary is correct," Heimerdinger replied, and as he spoke, he began to energetically knock on the door. However, despite several attempts, there was no response from within. Heimerdinger paused, took a break, and prepared to continue knocking. "Professor, let me try." Linwen quickly took his turn and started knocking on the door. "Sure, Linwen, but don't knock too hard. It should be rhythmic, not too loud. Zivi won't like it if you knock too hard," Heimerdinger advised. All right," Linwen nodded and followed the pattern of Heimerdinger's earlier knocking, making rhythmic and deliberate knocks on the door, thud thud thud, thud thud thud. Linwen continued this pattern of knocking for about 5 minutes before finally hearing movement from inside. Who is it? Came a female voice from within, clear and strong, accompanied by the jingling of something metallic. It's me, Zevi, Heimerdinger, replied Heimerdinger. Click. The door swung open, revealing a tall, dark-skinned woman. She appeared to be of a similar age as Jace and Victor and had an even more extravagant hairstyle than Six. Linwen had thought Six's tall hairdo was already quite extravagant among women, but the woman before him had taken it to the next level with a buzz cut. Even with the debuff a buzz cut, she still appeared strikingly beautiful. Professor, what brings you here? In her hand, she played with a small metallic knife, which emitted an unusual glow. It was a beautifully crafted vibrance blade. This item was standard equipment for the enforcers, but only squad leaders among them could possess it. Linwen had seen them for sale in stores on Constellaria Avenue, with a high price tag, well over 100 gold coins each. However, this blade she held seemed different. The vibrance blades Linwen had seen before, especially those made for enforcers, typically had a blade length of half a meter and a thicker, more club-like appearance. However, the one in her hand was the size of a cake knife, crafted from pure silver. Its silver blade emitted a blue aura, making it aesthetically pleasing. Was it a special edition? Ordinary vibrance blades were already pricey at 100 gold coins, so Linwen couldn't help but wonder. It seemed the Piltes had deep pockets. I've come with this gentleman. Heimerdinger raised his hands and introduced Linwen. You might have seen him, he's quite the sensation in the academy. Hello, I'm. Linwen began his introduction, but the other person laughed and spoke cheerfully, dark hair, dark eyes, an harmless young man. Linwen, right? I recognize you. She extended her hand toward Linwen. Let me introduce myself. Zevi Retta. Chapter 36 Fantastic. Ms. Retta. No need to be so formal, you can just call me Zevi. No need for surnames. I dislike all those formalities. Zevi opened the door and let Linwen and Heimerdinger in. Once inside, Linwen, guided by Heimerdinger, gaped at the objects around him. The laboratory's size rivaled those used by Jace and Victor, which clearly indicated that this laboratory was reserved for professors. And now, it is exclusively Zevi's. It's evident that Heimerdinger may not have been exaggerating. Among the students with such privileges, there are only 4 in total at Piltover University, 2 being Jace and Victor, and now, the one Linwen is facing, Zevi. The 4th student, a girl, is said to be personally inspecting geological research in Shurima. And now, Linwen looked at the various items before him. What caught his eye the most was a large contraption that resembled a mechanized suit. It was suspended on a mannequin with various wires and components scattered around, giving it a slightly chaotic yet impressively high-tech appearance. The outer shell was shaped like the letter T, fitting onto the mannequin's chest, with a flexible tube connecting to the lower chest and wrapping around the waist like a waist guard. Finally, there was a backplate similar to armor, attached to the mannequin's spine. Zevi's armor, incomplete equipment. Quality, incomplete. Effect, an unfinished piece. When completed, it will enhance the user's strength by 70 points, agility by 50 points, and provide the wearer with a special armor attack effect. Side effects, Zevi's incomplete creation, highly malleable, but wearing it prematurely is extremely dangerous. Danger Index, 91%. Prohibited to wear prematurely. Linwen, wait a minute, if Zevi manages to finish this thing, it could seriously boost a person's attributes. If Vander were to wear that, he'd turn into a monster, wouldn't he? Like Mundo or Warwick. Linwen's attitude toward Zevi, the woman with hair like Six's, changed as he looked at her again. Professor Heimerdinger is such a good person. He didn't lie to me. Yordles are truly honest. This is the only 2-star item Linwen has seen at his current level. You better not keep staring at that. It's an unfinished piece, and oh, by the way, you definitely shouldn't touch it, it's very dangerous because it's incomplete. Seeing Linwen's eagerness, Zevi found it amusing. She shrugged and said, because it's an unfinished piece, it's prone to malfunctions, and I don't even know if I'll ever finish it. Oh, by the way, Professor, what brings you and Linwen here? I believe I've told you that during times like this in the afternoon, unless it's something significant, please refrain from coming to see me. The room had several large tables, and Zevi walked up to one of the cluttered tables. She pushed aside a pile of papers to reveal 3 cups and a small jar, containing half a can of tea leaves. Then, she went over to a kettle on a shelf against the wall. Linwen noticed Zivi press something on the kettle, and it made a humming sound. It was heating up. Would you like some black tea? Of course, that's fine. Even though I had some earlier at Jace's place, I can always have more, Heimerdinger said with crossed arms, jumping onto the stool Zivi had prepared for him, and he spoke with a cheerful smile. Linwen nodded and said, "Thank you." Zivi remained silent until the water had boiled and 3 cups of black tea were prepared. Then she said, "Go on." Heimerdinger took a sip of tea and looked puzzled. "What?" "Professor," Linwen called out, somewhat exasperated. "Oh, right!" Heimerdinger exclaimed. Setting down his teacup, Heimerdinger explained, "Zivi, Linwen has come up with a small invention that requires someone highly skilled in mechanics. I originally thought of assisting him myself, but as a councilman, I have limited time. So I thought of you." Zivi, sipping her tea elegantly and placing the cup back onto the saucer, began, "First, my time is quite limited as well, and I have plenty of work to do on my own. Secondly, I'm the kind of person who only works on things that are interesting and cutting edge. Whether it's a weapon or a biological device, if it's not interesting enough, then don't come to me." Heimerdinger opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. Linwen watched this interaction and thought, "Well, I guess Heimerdinger is just too kind. His temperament is just incredibly good. As a councilman and the highest-ranking professor in the school, if he wanted to order Zivi to do something, could she refuse? That's clearly impossible." But Heimerdinger chose not to exercise his authority and instead sat there, struggling. "Zivi, could you at least listen to my idea?" Linwen asked. After seeing Zivi's inventions, Linwen was convinced that she was indeed a mechanical genius on par with Jace and Victor. Linwen believed that she had incredible talent, especially considering that she had crafted a 2-star piece of equipment without relying on magic. It might be unfinished, but that already demonstrated her potential. "I don't think so, Linwen. It's not that I look down on you, but very few things manage to pique my interest." "What about hextech technology?" Linwen asked. Zivi hesitated and looked to Heimerdinger, who nodded. "You see, he has a good relationship with Jace and Victor. They were the ones who jointly invented hextech technology. Though Linwen might be considered just an assistant. Sure, I'm willing to give it a try if it's hextech technology." Zivi changed her mind. Now it was Linwen's turn to feel awkward. The inventor of hextech is Jace, not him, and he couldn't just pull someone into the team. Besides, what he wanted to invent was his own idea, so he clarified to Zivi, "It's not something related to what Jace and Victor are developing now. It's my own concept. My idea requires the use of hextech gemstones, which is why I mentioned hextech technology." Zivi responded, "That's all right, in any case, as long as you can get that thing." "Oh, and you have a good relationship with Jace, don't you?" Zivi seemed quite familiar with Jace, and she nodded, saying, "Although Jace can be an annoying guy, arrogant and self-centered, he values his friends a lot." When it came to hextech technology, Zivi immediately showed interest. Currently, in Piltover, the most prominent figure is Jace Tallis and his hextech technology. Zivi is naturally interested in it too. She has attempted to develop hextech independently, but the hextech crystals available on the market are extremely unstable, categorized as dangerous goods. The art of processing crystals into gemstones that can be used in magic is only held by Jace and Victor. Jace and Victor don't even have enough of it for themselves now. Of course, they won't sell hextech gemstones to outsiders. Both of them are not in need of money at the moment. With Piltover's great families, Jace already has investment from both the Pharaoh's family and the Medarda family. Not to mention his connections with the Kiraman family. Money? Well, it's just paper. So, when Zivi heard that Linwen might have access to hextech gemstones after multiple unsuccessful attempts, she was naturally intrigued. Linwen wasted no time and explained his idea to Zivi, saying, "Hextech gemstones possess not only the ability to accelerate time and momentarily stop it but also the magical ability to transmit and store sound. What I want you to do is to modify hextech gemstones by altering their runic pathways. Different configurations and runes should allow hextech gemstones to produce different effects. I want to create a hextech gemstone that can distinguish various sounds." Zivi, however, misunderstood him. "If you want a voice recorder, I have one here. You don't need to use hextech for that." She blinked her purple eyes and retrieved a small box to hand it to Linwen. Linwen accepted the box but was uncertain about Zivai's intentions. Speak to it, Zivai said, touching the top of the box. Speak to it about what? Linwen didn't grasp it. Zivai took the box back and drew a circle on top. Speak to it. It was her voice. Speak about what? It was Linwen's voice. Oh, it dawned on him. This box had a recording function. Linwen stared at the box in disbelief and then returned it to Zivai. No, no, no. You misunderstood my idea. I don't want a recording box. I want to create something that allows two people to communicate remotely. For example, someone standing on the bridge could communicate in real time with us here. That's impossible. Real-time communication over such distances? You're talking about magic, Zivai scoffed. But Heimerdinger, still seated, clapped his hands. Wow, Linwen, your idea is fantastic. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Before Linwen could respond, Professor Heimerdinger continued to mutter to himself, Hextech technology can transmit and accelerate things, it can even manipulate time. If we modify the runes, it might be possible to transmit sound. If we can establish certain rules, it might just work. Heimerdinger jumped off his chair, pacing back and forth, deep in thought. Zivai, watching the pacing professor, turned to Linwen and said, I think we need to have another conversation about this. Chapter 37 I really can't. If you want to do this, Linwen, it will be quite troublesome. In the laboratory, Zivai and Linwen began a real preliminary discussion, and Heimerdinger joined in as well. For Heimerdinger, while his role as a councilor was essential, inventions and the unknown were even more significant. Moreover, to put it bluntly, Heimerdinger was like a mascot in the council, and no one expected him to make a substantial political contribution to Piltover. Therefore, after Zivai agreed to help Linwen, Heimerdinger didn't leave. He joined the two of them, providing guidance and brainstorming. The instability of Hextech crystals has been improved by Jace and Victor, resulting in relatively safe stability. However, attempting to inscribe runes on them using a sonic blade, rather than employing Jace's method of writing runes inside, is a difficult task with significant risks. But, Zivai, what I want is not one-on-one information transmission. I want something that can broadcast to multiple recipients. So, that's why I initially mentioned creating Hextech gemstones capable of distinguishing various sounds. Or, to be more precise, what I want is a gemstone that can connect to different channels just by manipulating a button, Linwen explained. Wait a minute. If I understand your idea correctly, Linwen, you want to create something that can facilitate not only remote communication between two people but also communication with different individuals. Heimerdinger slammed his hand on the table, excitedly asking, is it what I think it is? Yes, Professor, but please calm down for a moment, Linwen responded. Heimerdinger exclaimed, how can I calm down? Oh, if this can be achieved, the distance between people will become even closer. You and Jace are indeed close friends. He's planning to build portals to make it faster for people worldwide to reach Piltover, and what you want to create is a way for the voice of Piltover to reach the ears of the entire world. You two are truly close friends. Linwen. Believe it or not, Professor, Jace almost got punched by me several times. Does that still count as being close friends? In that case, we first need to achieve one thing, which is storing sound in Hextech gemstones. Then we can work on enabling sound exchange between two gemstones. Now, thinking of anything else is not useful, we need to take it one step at a time, Linwen explained. Zivai pondered for a moment. It can definitely be done, Linwen stated with confidence. Given the potential of Hextech gemstones, Linwen believed that creating a phone using them was simply a matter of time. After all, this substance, in Jace's hands, would one day lead to the creation of Hextech gates and, in Echo's hands, the Z-Drive, a device capable of controlling localized time. The term magic inherently represented the unbelievable. As long as magic was involved, there was nothing simple. Therefore, Linwen was confident that Hextech gemstones could be used to create Hextech phones. And if Linwen and Zivai truly succeeded in making Hextech phones, what would it mean? It meant money. Endless wealth. Not to mention that with a phone, Linwen could communicate with Six and Powder whenever he wanted without any issues. After all, he was worried about not seeing Six and Powder for a long time. Even in the depths of the Undercity, even with the protection of Vander, Zaun is Zaun, and safety is a rarity there. So if Linwen could hear Powder's voice every day, well, he's just worried about the little one's safety, that's all. In any case, as the conversation continued, Linwen spoke abstractly while Zivi listened. Zivi was truly a genius. She managed to understand Linwen's abstract ideas perfectly and even created preliminary drafts. Zivi was eager to see what would happen when the phone that Linwen described was actually created. Is your sonic blade custom-made? During this time, Zivi used her sonic blade to cut pieces of metal and find materials with the appropriate hardness. After all, a hex-deck phone should be convenient to carry, so they needed to think about the casing. They couldn't just use a round stone. So when Linwen described a casing for the hex-deck gemstone, Zivi was already thinking about designing a casing mold. Is this what you mean? Watching Linwen eyeing her sonic blade, Zivi squinted and casually replied, a custom-made multi-frequency sonic blade? Well, you could say that. Is this blade very expensive? Linwen inquired. Zivi didn't directly answer but looked at Linwen, smirking. Well, I'm from the Retta family, Linwen. Heimerdinger clapped Linwen's arm and explained, the multi-frequency sonic blade is part of the Retta family's history, kid. Zivi is the creator of the multi-frequency sonic blade, the world's first one. By the way, child, how old were you when you invented this blade? Black Mark rubbed his hands and looked at Zivi. Zivi continued to cut metal and answered nonchalantly, 5 years old, Professor. Linwen. 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 Linwen, wait, am I hearing this right? How old? 5 years old, I was trying to cut sandwiches at the time, Zivi recalled her past and casually continued, those metal utensils were so difficult to use. I had to cut with force every time, and it still didn't come out neatly. So, I invented this blade. Zivi raised her hand and shook her pretty little knife. And what about Linwen? He was questioning his life choices. He thought 9-year-old Echo was a prodigy, but this person was even more exceptional. Linwen. Comparing Zivi to Jace and Victor. What on earth were Jace and Victor doing at the age of 5? Victor at the age of 5 was probably playing with boats, right? And Heimerdinger, laughing, said, that's why I said she's a genius, Linwen. When Jace was 5, he was dreaming of becoming a big hero. See, the professor provided the answer. At 5 years old, Victor and Jace were still playing, while the person in front of him invented the world's first multi-frequency sonic blade. And as soon as this blade appeared, it immediately became a great weapon for the Piltover enforcers. Don't give me that exaggerated look. Is this really a difficult thing? Zivi nonchalantly remarked. It's too easy. Metal pieces were neatly cut and placed on the table, and Zivi said, unconcerned, as she met Linwen's gaze. She didn't take it seriously at all. After all, her initial purpose in inventing the blade was simply to make it easier for herself to cut sandwiches. If you want, you can do it too. If you can't even handle something as simple as that, are you still a human? Okay, Linwen, tell me more about your idea. Zivi spoke softly. Haha, Linwen suddenly understood why the professor found Zivi's personality difficult to deal with. If you want, you can do it too? Can I really do that? I'm sorry, but I really can't. Chapter 38 Friend. October 7th, at 8 o'clock in the morning. Linwen got up from his bed, prepared himself, and headed towards Jace's laboratory. Today, he needed to get a few hextech gems from Jace, but he wasn't sure if Jace would give them to him, as these items were currently in high demand. In recent times, traveling merchants from outside Piltover had also set their eyes on Mr. Talus's inventions. Just as Professor Heimerdinger had mentioned, Jace had become the rising star of Piltover, and everyone from the council to the residents knew that a young man was trying to blend magic and technology to create a new era. As a result, the importance of hextech gems. Well, Linwen wasn't entirely sure. He reached the laboratory door, composed his expression, smiled, and gently pushed the door open. It was not yet 8:30 in the morning, but Jace was already in the lab. Victor was also nearby, and the two were silently going about their work. However, this silence only referred to the absence of spoken words, but there were the sounds of heavy objects being struck. Boom! Thud! Jace held a massive hammer in his hand and raised it high, then struck down with force onto a hextech gem embedded in a stone slab. Linwen's eyes involuntarily twitched. If that thing exploded, Jace, who was closest, would be sent flying by the shockwave. A light impact could result in fractures, and a severe one could turn him into a bloody pulp. Hey, Jace. Linwen approached Jace and patted his broad back. Linwen, you came at the right time. Quick, you're strong, help me with this. Upon hearing Linwen's voice, Jace showed a hint of delight and handed the hammer to Linwen. He said, help me strike it real hard. How should I strike it? Linwen rolled up his sleeves and held the hammer while looking at Jace. Smash the Hextech gem on the top. This is a large-sized Hextech gem that Victor and I developed recently. It contains 3 times the energy of a regular gem. I need this stone slab to use as a base. Are you sure it won't explode? Linwen hesitated. Hextech crystals breaking could lift Linwen off the ground, and Hextech gems breaking could potentially result in 2 out of the 3 people in the room meeting an unfortunate fate. Don't worry, it won't shatter. The latest gem's internal structure is stable enough, and gravity won't alter its internal composition. So go ahead and hit it with confidence. Scientists always said things like, it won't go wrong, it won't explode, trust us, it's safe. Of course, Linwen felt relieved, but in case of any mishap in research at this level, it's practically synonymous with death. Jace gave Linwen a big thumbs up and urged him, all right, I'm counting on you. Got it. Linwen took a deep breath, then followed Jace's instructions and swung the hammer with all his might. He arched his back, used all his strength, and struck the massive metal hammerhead onto the gem. It emitted a brilliant blue light. Boom! Victor, who was working on his research, turned in surprise. He had just felt the ground shake, and even the table trembled. That's it, Linwen, give it to me. Jace exclaimed excitedly. Linwen's single swing felt like the work of a heavy-duty machine. Jace originally thought that if he couldn't do it, he would have to wait until the afternoon and ask for help from the mechanics in another area. But now, Linwen had made it look easy. What an excellent assistant! A few minutes later, when Linwen had successfully embedded the Hextech gem into the metallic plate, penetrating it by over 10 centimeters, Jace finally instructed him to stop. Jace touched the smooth surface of the stone plate and displayed a satisfied expression. Great, no need to wait until the afternoon, no need for a long trip back and forth, and no need to ask for help. He then turned to Linwen and asked, by the way, Linwen, what did you need me for? I have a small invention that requires Hextech gems, so I came to ask for some from you, Linwen replied to Jace. Then, considering Jace's arrogant and self-assured personality, Linwen quickly added, of course, I know they're very valuable. I can start with an IOU. Before Linwen could finish his sentence, Jace looked at him strangely, saying, what are you talking about? We're friends, after all. Hextech is my invention, but you've also helped me. Well, even if you were just assisting me, as I mentioned to you before, you saved me. So, I'll consider the Hextech as my way of repaying you. Of course, Victor has a share too, and he's in charge of the Hextech gems now. Jace displayed his pearly white teeth and laughed heartily. Despite having faced life and death, Jace remained the same Jace, the incredibly brilliant yet arrogantly self-confident individual. But he was no longer the Jace driven solely by fame, fortune, and power. Jace's current desire was singular, to join forces with Victor and genuinely advance Hextech technology for the betterment of everyone in Piltover. This was their common goal. Science is progress. Progress is beauty. This was their shared vision. Victor. Jace waved and called out loudly. Jace, could you keep it down a bit? I can hear you talking. I'm just cripple, not deaf. Victor, who was generally mild-tempered, turned around, and in a rather displeased tone, he said, I've been working for 3 nights straight, 3 nights. And now, I am seriously warning you, Jace Tallis. Victor leaned on his cane and walked over to a large blue box. He placed his finger on a button, and with a click, the box opened, revealing a large number of Hextech gems inside. Victor picked up a few and continued, please, in the future, keep the same schedule as I do. Don't forge hammers when I'm trying to sleep because I can't sleep in a noisy environment like you. Can you blame me? Linwen, why don't you be the judge? I told him to go back to the dorm and sleep, but he decided not to, Jace argued. I'm doing this for Hextech, Victor scolded Jace, but when he turned to Linwen, his expression softened, and his tone became gentle and soothing instead of irate. Are these enough for you? Enough, Linwen accepted them, receiving a total of 4 Hextech gems. His initial plan was for 2 because he wanted to create a system for voice communication. However, Victor provided him with 4. If it's not enough, come find me, or you can take it yourself. The password is the first letter of Jace's name, Victor said, letting out a yawn, clearly fatigued. By the way, would you and Jace like to participate in my invention? How about getting credit for it? Linwen asked. Victor smiled and responded, of course, we can. However, Jace, not far away, protested, no way, my name can't be slapped on any random invention. Are you sure you don't want to? Linwen added. He wanted to repay Victor and Jace, even though he was currently penniless. Luckily, he still had a great idea to share. Linwen was convinced that if the Hextech phone were successfully developed, its impact would be significant. Having their names attached would be a beneficial gesture. Of course, I don't want to. Your brain simply can't keep up. You're the first person whose brain couldn't keep pace with mine, yet I still considered a friend, Jace chuckled. Linwen felt his fist getting itchy. All right, if you don't have anything else, don't bother me and Victor. Go sit over there, have some food and tea, and wait for me to call you, okay? Jace said. No way, Linwen responded with a mischievous smile, holding the Hextech gems. He dashed to the door, calling out to Jace and Victor, I'm going to work on my invention. I won't have time to help you with odd jobs anymore. After saying that, Linwen turned and ran. There was a stagger in his footsteps. Jace scrambled to the door, watching Linwen disappear into the distance. He wasn't surprised at all. Because that guy was not only strong but also incredibly fast. However, without Linwen, how would they manage all the miscellaneous tasks? Despite being a bit of a dimwit, Linwen was a useful one. Then, within the early hours at Piltover University, a mournful scream echoed. No. Linwen, come back. I need you. Inside the room, Victor was pressing his cane against his head bobbing up and down. It appeared that Victor had fallen asleep while standing and was startled by the scream. Jace. Victor unusually raised his voice. Linwen ran away. Victor, without Linwen's help, moving all those heavy objects will require a lot of manpower. Wait, Victor, don't be angry. Stay away, don't come any closer. All right, it's my fault. I won't make any noise when you're sleeping, okay? Victor approached Jace, and Jace begged, really? Really? Bonk. That was the sound of a cane hitting someone's head. Chapter 39 Good Relationships. Piltover University had an extremely strong academic atmosphere, and this was perhaps the only place in Piltover without power struggles, thanks to the leadership of Heimerdinger. Under his wise guidance, Piltover University became a sanctuary for Piltover scientists before they embarked on their careers. Regardless of whether you were an investor from any family, and no matter whom you had invested in, you couldn't interfere in a student's inventions while they were at the university. In the school, everything revolved around the students' ideas. In this environment, Linwen quickly lost track of time while diligently exploring the possibility of the Hextech phone. Soon, he had been living in the upper city for a month. He had known Zevi Retta for a month as well, and during this period, his relationship with Zevi had grown closer. The chief mechanist of Piltover University was actually quite easy to get along with, provided you followed the rules she had established. Professor, can you hear me? My goodness, Linwen, you've done an outstanding job. Professor, I just explained the principles, the real credit goes to Zevi. Heimerdinger nodded without a doubt, you both have done an outstanding job. In Zevi's laboratory at this moment, Heimerdinger was listening to the sound coming from the table. Although it was somewhat distorted, he could recognize the voice as Zevi's. With his hands crossed, Heimerdinger said, Zevi, can you hear me? Yes, Professor, but your voice sounds a bit distorted, quite unnatural. Both Linwen and Heimerdinger exchanged a glance and looked at the small device on the table. It was a blue and white rectangular box with a size that fit comfortably in one's hand. It featured various numeric buttons and combined shades of sky blue and silver, making it appealing to both men and women. I can't believe it. It's only been a month, a very short time, but you have achieved so much, Heimerdinger praised. We haven't really achieved it, Professor, Zevi remarked. She continued, what Linwen wants is not a pair of simple communication boxes. He's looking for something more advanced. The current communication range of these phones is too short, Professor. They can only operate within a 15-meter range, which is not what we're aiming for. Yes, Zevi is right, Professor. The current phones don't even have the capability for broadcasting. They can only make one-to-one calls. One-to-one, single-directional, isn't that like a walkie-talkie? Heimerdinger had been following Linwen and Zevi's inventions, but he hadn't been there throughout the process, so he was not fully aware of the details. In his eyes, the real invention of the telephone had only just begun. However, making a real telephone shouldn't take much longer, Zevi said confidently. Being a true genius, she could easily grasp the concepts Linwen was discussing. Addressing Heimerdinger on the other end of the line, she continued, all we need to do is to improve the clarity of the inscriptions and, as Linwen suggested, set up a hextech station in the academy using several hextech gems to receive the information from each phone and inscribe it. This would give us the basic functionality of a telephone. And it won't take long to accomplish this. Heimerdinger tilted his head, blinked his large eyes, and asked, do you need my help? Linwen replied with a smile, no, Professor. Just as Zevi mentioned, this work won't take much longer. At most, it will require 6 more months, and we'll have our first functional telephone. The power of hextech was astounding, so much so that Linwen found it challenging to explain. Telephones traditionally relied on the conversion of electric and sound energy, using electricity to transmit information. However, with the inclusion of hextech gems, the magic involved far surpassed scientific capabilities. Hextech gems could accomplish a wide range of tasks on their own. Initially, Linwen had been contemplating the issue of usage range. If the telephone couldn't function over long distances, its purpose would be significantly limited. However, Zevi provided a solution right away. Zevi's solution was inspired by Linwen's casual mention of base station. Hextech gems had the capacity to store information and retain memory. By loading different hextech telephone models into designated hextech gems and configuring them accordingly as base stations, the following scenario would occur. Suppose A initiates a call to B, and they are within the appropriate range. The two phones would directly establish a connection. However, if A's hextech gem's energy range couldn't reach B's location, the magical energy from A's phone would pass through the nearest hextech base station. A group of advanced hextech gems, interconnected in a network, would accept A's magical energy, assess A's dialing capabilities, and actively search for B's energy to establish a link between the two phones. This way, B can receive A's phone call. Zevi's approach not only solved the distance issue but also eliminated the possibility of counterfeiting. Even though Piltover had copyrights, in reality, telephones weren't very complex devices. The only real challenges were the availability of hextech gems and microfabrication skills. The first point, the availability of hextech gems, would no longer be a valuable commodity in the future. As hextech technology became widespread in just a few years, these gems would be common. The second point, Zevi's exceptional craftsmanship as a mechanist in Piltover, was undeniable. However, it was important to note that on the other side of Runeterra, in Shurima, there were numerous skilled crystal fabricators who excelled in microfabrication. They were certainly capable of working with hextech gems. As a result, Zevi's method effectively eliminated the possibility of counterfeit hextech telephones. Linwen was incredibly thankful that Heimerdinger introduced him to Zevi. Initially, the telephone had only been an idea in Linwen's mind, and he had never imagined that he could potentially create it within a year. Just then, the door swung open, and Zevi entered holding another pink telephone. She had an irritated expression on her face. Her reason for being upset? Linwen, please take Jace and leave my lab. She directed her words at Linwen. Heimerdinger curiously peeked in, only to see a tall and handsome young man who was a head taller than Zevi, squeezing his way through the door. He had his arms open, and he exclaimed, Zevi, please return Linwen to me, he's mine. Linwen's response? Heimerdinger slapped himself on the face. Jace is here again. This is the third time this month that Heimerdinger witnessed such a scene. Although he had met with Linwen and Zevi a maximum of 10 times in this month, he had seen this scenario 3 times, showing just how frequent Jace's visits were. Enough, Jace. I've told you countless times, Zevi said with a stern tone. It's not Linwen following me to do research, it's me following Linwen to conduct research. He's the founder of the hextech telephone. Upon hearing this, Jace stood upright, and he spoke very seriously to Zevi, do you think that just by saying this, I will believe you? Given Linwen's brain, he couldn't have come up with something like this. Before Jace could finish his sentence, Linwen covered Jace's mouth. Jace turned to look at Linwen, saying, "MMMMMM? Are you coming back with me?" Linwen responded, "Shut up." Linwen picked Jace up, slung him over his shoulder, and gave Zevi an apologetic look. Then, he walked away, ignoring Jace's protests. This left Heimerdinger in an amused state and Zevi feeling somewhat angry. "Professor, please stop laughing. Jace has disrupted my plans so many times, and it's really annoying." Zevi expressed her frustration to Heimerdinger. But Heimerdinger chuckled and said, "Could this possibly be a bad thing, my dear? I've always been worried that you were too focused on your inventions and forgot about the people around you. You've never really had any friends. But look at you now, calling him Mr. Tallis and now addressing him as Jace. What does that prove?" "It doesn't mean I like him," Zevi replied, exasperated. But Heimerdinger shook his head, and as the Yordle hopped off his stool, he walked away, hands behind his back, making sharp remarks as he reached the door. "My child, social interaction is also an essential skill. Look, Linwen and Jace, they have such a good relationship. You still have much to learn, my child." With that, Heimerdinger's figure disappeared, leaving Zevi to look at the blue phone on the desk and the pink phone in her hand. The genius young mechanic fell silent for a while, then rubbed her head vigorously. "Damn it! You've really messed up my plans," Zevi muttered quietly in the room. Chapter 40 No specific reason. "Linwen, put me down, you're embarrassing me." Standing at nearly 2 meters in height, Jace was being carried by Linwen, who was less than 5 feet tall. The scene was somewhat amusing. Jace covered his face, shouting loudly in protest. But what was the use of his strength against Linwen's? In this past month, Linwen had not only created the initial version of the Hextech walkie-talkie with Zevi but also successfully activated 2 new champion cards. His power had increased significantly. The method for enhancing his abilities was to increase the affinity with champions. At Piltover University, Linwen could interact with 4 different champions, but only 3 of them had steadily improved their affinity. These 3 champions were Professor Heimerdinger, Jace Tallis, and Victor. After all, she only occasionally came to the academy to see Jace. And lately, Jace has been busy researching Hextech technology with Victor, so he has no time to interact with her. Consequently, she simply stopped coming to the academy. Linwen activated champion cards for 2 champions, which wasn't surprising since he had known Jace and Victor from the beginning. Both Jace and Victor were 4-star champions. Defender of Tomorrow. Machine Herald. This increased Linwen's stats by 60 points. However, it puzzled Linwen that Jace was indeed a strength-based champion. Although he was aware of it from the League of Legends game, seeing Jace in person as a scientist made it hard for him to accept. Jace was a scientist with muscles, and this scientist primarily had strength as his main attribute. This just didn't seem logical. Could it be that Jace, after obtaining the Mercury Hammer, has become a different person? Or is it that the hammer has added numerous attributes to Jace? Otherwise, this just doesn't make scientific sense. A 4-star card Jace should undoubtedly have higher combat power than 6, but from the looks of it now, Jace is undeniably weaker. As for Victor, his 4-star rating was understandable. Looking at his background, it wouldn't be a surprise if he approached 5 stars in the future. As the Machine Herald, Victor had limitless potential. But what about Jace? He didn't undergo any alchemical transformations and had a regular human body. Speaking of Jace's current combat power, to be honest, despite his muscular physique sculpted from hammer training, Linwen envied it, but when it came to actual combat ability, well, to put it bluntly, 6 could probably pin Jace to the ground within 3 minutes in a freestyle fight. What did being 1.9 meters tall matter? Even being 1.9 doesn't mean he want to get hit. Victor's intelligence type was unsurprising, and his appearance finally pushed Linwen's intelligence past 3 digits. Now, Linwen's stats were as follows. Player, Linwen. Level, 21. Strength, 186. Agility, 186. Intelligence, 121. Mana, 0. Skills, Advanced Repair, Advanced Swordsmanship, Penetrating Force. Champion cards, Piltover Enforcer, the Loose Cannon. // When I search up Wiki, Jinx had 2 titles, the Demolition Diva and the Loose Cannon. I don't know which one is better. Y'all choose // Items, Chrono Ring, Duran's Blade, Damaged Unknown Rune Fragment X1, Raptor Cloak. Remaining draw attempts, 0. Linwen still only had 2 champion cards, with his strength and agility both reaching 186, while his intelligence had reached 121. As for his level, he didn't care about it anymore, at least as it stood now, his level seemed to be completely useless. The activation of a 3-star champion card added 20 points to his 3 stats, making it equivalent to level 20 attributes, not to mention the direct effect of adding 100 to the main attribute after obtaining it. Level, hey. Including the lottery chances Linwen obtained from Powder earlier, he has used 3 lottery chances in total, resulting in receiving the Raptor Cloak, along with intermediate swordsmanship and then up to advanced swordsmanship. Well, he got 3-star skills, which should indicate good luck, but why didn't he receive them directly? In any case, Linwen has become stronger, and he can clearly feel this newfound strength. Therefore, how could Jace possibly escape from his grasp? Enough, Linwen, put me down. This is too embarrassing. Linwen, if you don't put me down right now, I swear I'll get angry. Jace vigorously patted Linwen's back, unafraid of hurting Linwen since he was a veritable beast, comparable to the monsters from the Shurima desert. Hearing the cries behind him, Linwen chuckled and shook his shoulders forcefully, causing Jace to almost vomit his breakfast. With a loud he pushed his body up and away from Linwen's shoulder, trying to feel a bit better. Linwen didn't care about the onlookers and their judgment. Now, it was Jace who was the more embarrassing one. He continued, "Do you even know what's embarrassing, Jace? I've told you countless times, please don't disturb me and Zevi during work hours. But what have you done?" Linwen carried Jace through the campus, and along the way, this duo attracted numerous glances. Some girls covered their mouths and giggled as they observed the pair. On one side was Jace, the most famous student in the academy right now. On the other was Linwen, the academy's most dashing handyman. Plus, with Linwen carrying Jace in a way that completely disrespected the future star Jace, it naturally drew countless looks and attention. In response to those amused glances and laughter, Jace quickly spoke, "I didn't come this time to disturb you and Zevi in your research. I came to invite you. Oh. In a few days, it's Progress Day. I'd like to invite you to attend the Kiraman family's dinner with me." Linwen paused. "I can go? I'm just a Zaunite. What's the problem with that? Victor is also a Zaunite, isn't he? Linwen, you've managed to get Zevi to work for you, which has attracted a lot of attention to your Hextech phone. They are closely watching you now. Are you ready to join a major family?" Having spoken, Jace awaited Linwen's response. He thought Linwen would be excited about this opportunity. After all, Victor had worked hard for many years to gain the support of Piltover's prominent families in the field of Hextech technology. Yet Linwen, who had only been in Piltover for a few months, was already being considered for investment by one of the major families. Linwen was even being recruited by a major family. As long as Linwen agreed to sign an agreement, he could become part of Piltover. But Linwen's response was silence. Linwen remained silent for a long time. Then, he finally spoke with a tone of regret, saying, "I'm sorry, Jace, but I don't plan to join a Piltover family." "Why, Linwen?" "Research requires funding. Professor Heimerdinger can't sponsor you indefinitely, and Zevi doesn't have the capacity. Hextech crystals are currently invaluable. While our relationship is great, and I'm more than willing to help you, Linwen, it's evident that the quantity of Hextech crystals you need is too substantial. The family standing behind me won't approve of me blindly supporting you, unless you're also willing to join them. There's no such thing as a free lunch, right?" Seeing Linwen still silent, Jace grew agitated and said, "Join the Pharaoh's family with me. Isn't that a good thing? Do you know how many people in Piltover want the Pharaoh's family's sponsorship?" "Jace, that's enough." Linwen interrupted Jace and took a deep breath. He continued, "Has Victor already joined a Piltover family?" "No, not yet. They're currently investing in me, and there are families trying to recruit Victor, but he declined. And you're in a similar situation now. What's the matter with you guys? Linwen, what's the reason behind you and Victor's refusal?" Jace was quite puzzled. As someone who had grown up in Piltover, he understood the city's rules well. Now, Piltover's rules were willing to open doors for 2 Zaunites, but they refused? This isn't reasonable. "No specific reason," Linwen replied with a smile. Jace, I come from Zaun, I'm a Zaunite, Linwen continued. He breathed a sigh of relief. Victor was still connected to his roots. Chapter 41. Ouch! Are you going back to Zaun again? It's okay if you are going back to Zaun, but how can you choose this day to return? Progress Day is approaching, and you tell me you are going back to Zaun? Are you crazy? Linwen, I just find it strange. What's good about Zaun? It's dirty, chaotic, and stinky. The streets are filled with dangerous people, and it's both perilous and impoverished. This was an incredibly KY speech, and only Mr. Tallis could make such comments. At this moment, in Jace's laboratory, Victor was sitting on a stool with one hand on his cane and the other holding a cup of hot tea. He looked at Jace, who was standing at the door, gesturing as he spoke. Victor could only roll his eyes helplessly, and suddenly, he felt that the tea in his hand was no longer fragrant. When it came to Zaun, the people of Piltover always had an attitude of pride and arrogance. Jace could confirm this, even though he knew that Victor and Linwen were from Zaun. However, in the presence of these two Zaunites, Jace still talked confidently about how terrible their hometown was. This made Victor, who was also a Zaunite, quite uncomfortable. He admitted that he preferred to be in Piltover than to stay in Zaun. The academic atmosphere here was well suited for someone like him who was dedicated to science. After all, in Zaun, it was difficult to do research properly. The gang violence there was rampant, and people like Victor were often the first to get hurt. Jace was right in saying that Zaun was dirty, chaotic, and impoverished, and that many people there only cared about their immediate interests, with little regard for the concept of science for the future. But, no matter how bad Zaun was, and no matter how people from Zaun liked to complain about it, Victor didn't want to hear derogatory comments about Zaun from the mouths of Piltover residents. It was a difficult feeling to put into words, but it truly made people feel uncomfortable. These two cities, so close to each other, were once a single city 200 years ago. Yet, 2 centuries later, they had entirely different cultures, beliefs, and civilizations. This was a unique phenomenon in the world of Runeterra, the daily life of the twin sister cities, Piltover and Zaun. Jace, that's enough. Stop complaining, Victor said, interrupting Jace before Linwen could even respond. He placed the teacup on a saucer, stood up, and said, please respect Linwen and me. After all, we're both Zaunites. I believe he feels the same as I do. We don't want to hear your complaints about the Undercity from your mouth anymore. Victor, you know that's not what I mean. I'm just stating a fact to you, Jace quickly explained, seeing Victor unhappy. However, his explanation even made Linwen, who had been holding back, burst into laughter. Yes, yes, our noble Lord Tallis. Since you dislike Zaun so much, how about Victor and I leave tomorrow? The two of us Zaunites can leave your sight so as not to dirty your eyes. Otherwise, if might go blind, then what will happen to Hextech? Why are you acting like this? You and Victor both know I didn't mean it that way. Getting impatient, aren't you? Jace didn't quite understand what getting impatient meant, but seeing Linwen sarcastically say it, he felt a bit annoyed. I just wanted to say that even if you plan to go back to Zaun, you shouldn't choose this day. It's Progress Day, the most important and lively day in Piltover every year. On that day, countless outsiders will come to Piltover to witness Progress Day. They come from far and wide, and you two are going back to Zaun on that day. Jace truly couldn't understand it. Progress Day was the most important annual festival for Piltover. On that day, the entire city of Piltover would be on holiday, and a grand celebration would last for 3 days. During this time, there was no curfew in Piltover, and various inventions would be exhibited. Jace's Hextech technology was, of course, part of it. This time, Hextech was even a highlight. It wouldn't be presented within the academy but rather in the Grand Theatre, and there was even a possibility it would be shown in the main hall of Piltover. This was a recognition of Jace, Victor, and, of course, Linwen. But now, Linwen was telling him that he would return to Zaun on that day? Is Zaun celebrating Progress Day too? Otherwise, I don't understand why you have to go back to Zaun. Jace thought about it but couldn't comprehend how Zaun's Progress Day could compare to Piltover's grand celebration. Progress Day? Linwen then chuckled, a somewhat sarcastic laugh. Victor remained silent, looking down at his shoes without saying a word. Only Jace stood there, sensing that something was off, with a puzzled expression. He muttered softly, "Wait, Did I say something wrong again? Linwen stared at Jace, lost for words. He genuinely couldn't get angry with him. After all, Jace treated Linwen as a friend, and that was good enough. Moreover, Jace was not the type to engage in intrigue. He was a pure scientist, much like Victor. His words were probably thoughtless, not ill-intentioned. But Jace had been deeply influenced by Piltover's perspective, and his view of the Undercity was as it should be. He didn't want to understand the current situation in Zaun or care about the environment in which Zaunites were living. This was normal. After all, the fire hadn't burned him, so why would he be in a hurry? Piltover's Progress Day was a day of pride for Piltoverians, but it represented hardship for Zaunites. How did Progress Day come to be? Linwen repeated the question. Regarding this piece of history, Jace was naturally well aware. Proudly, he spoke of the creation of Piltover. In the year 772 AE, during the Grand Canal operation, Piltover was born. And that day happened to be the 8th of November in the year 772. Therefore, every year on the 8th of November, it is called Progress Day. I'm asking you how it came to be. Linwen repeated his question. Victor had a complex expression as he stood by. This was the sorrow known only to Zaunites. Down in the city is called Zaun, and the city that stands above it is called Pil. Jace suddenly stopped talking. He had an epiphany. He wanted to give himself a slap for what he had said to Linwen and Victor before. After calming down a bit, Jace figured it out. Before he got to know Linwen and Victor, he didn't care about Zaun. Every time he went to Zaun, it was just a quick in and out visit. He had no desire to understand anything about Zaun. Linwen, Victor, I didn't mean that. I know. Otherwise, you should be kneeling on the ground now, with me having slapped you so hard you'd have throw up your dinner, Linwen said with a smirk. But Jace's facial expression, with a fake smile and tense features, made him uncomfortable. How strong was Linwen? If he had really thrown a punch, Jace thought it might not have only throw up his dinner but his, well, you get the idea. I'm going back to Zaun as a part of an agreement with my family to commemorate. Linwen didn't finish his sentence. But Victor understood what Linwen meant. The Grand Canal incident had forcibly separated Zaun into two. Half of Zaun had collapsed into the chasms, while the other half had risen and become Piltover. The part that had sunk was still called Zaun, but the risen part had changed its name to Piltover. They celebrated the new beginning as Progress Day because the Grand Canal had caused Zaun to collapse and connect the two continents. It had truly become the choke point of the Rune-Terran continent, making a fortune from collecting tariffs alone. Piltover had embraced this day as a celebration of its rebirth. For the Zaunites who had fallen below, Progress Day was a day of mourning, a festival to honor the friends and family they had lost in the incident. Victor's eyes darkened a little. Even though it had been more than 2 centuries ago, Zaunites would never forget this day. But Jace, not quite understanding where the line was, exclaimed in amazement to Linwen, "You have a family? You've never told me about your family, so I thought you were an orphan." Upon hearing this, Linwen said nothing. He chuckled to himself. "Well, Jace, it's okay. You're actually correct. I am an orphan. I was taken in by old Zoran." However, Jace's comment did surprise Linwen. He was indeed an orphan, and it was old Zoran who had taken him in. Despite having 2 lovely sisters and a few annoying brothers, sometimes, it just becomes unbearable. "Can't you just stay quiet, please? Blabbering all day long as if you're afraid people don't know you have a mouth?" Standing up, Linwen clenched his fist and walked towards Jace, grinning as he said, "Bite down hard." "What are you doing? Just bite down hard." Ouch. Chapter 42 Happy Progress Day. On November 5th, at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Linwen, after a brief lunch break, strolled into the mechanical district and entered Zivai's laboratory. As he walked in, he saw Zivai yawning and sitting up from a simple cot. Zivai was wearing a warm wool sweater, layered with a deep blue autumn coat. One notable feature of her attire was a peculiar but cleverly designed chain-link clasp, which, if caught in machinery, could be quickly pulled to remove the clothing. For Linwen, it was a simple outfit, a white long-sleeved knit shirt paired with beige pants. "Why are you here so early today? Usually, you don't show up until after 2:30, Zivai said, relaxing her furrowed brows. She gazed at Linwen as she put on her coat and walked over to the desk. She reached for the strongly brewed red tea, took a sip, shook her head, feeling instantly more awake. Then she prepared herself to work. Zevi was not only a top mechanic at Piltover University but also a prodigious inventor. Linwen approached her and said, "I need to talk to you. Zevi, can we process the 2 extra gemstones we have into a phone as soon as possible? I have a use for it. The performance doesn't need to be too advanced, just the ability to make and receive calls within a range of a dozen meters." For Zevi, the gemstone processing was as simple as eating and drinking. The reason for the lengthy previous research was due to her work on inscribing runes and the calculations for various constructions. Therefore, when the first step was taken, creating a phone required far less time than a month. Linwen believed that with Zevi's skills, it wouldn't take long to create the device. Zevi leaned on the table, looking down at the blueprints on her desk, and said, "What do you need it for? A phone with a range of a dozen meters won't be very useful. If you want to communicate with someone, you could just shout within that range, couldn't you?" Linwen replied, "I want to give it to someone." Zevi gave Linwen a strange look and said, "I thought you might want to showcase it at Progress Day to attract investors. But you want to give it away? What are you thinking? Well, this is your creation, and if it makes you happy, that should be enough." Zevi was starting to find Linwen's actions increasingly puzzling. Linwen was about to explain when Zevi waved her hand, turning her back to him, and said, "All right, I don't want to hear your reasons. It's just a range of a dozen meters, right? You can come to collect it the day after tomorrow. Now, Mr. Linwen, I think it's time for us to start working." "Agreed," Linwen said, breathing a sigh of relief. Zevi was a person who valued rules, but since getting to know Linwen, she realized that her own rules were slowly being broken. So recently, she had been reconsidering and imposing some of her own rules onto herself. Whether they were effective or not, only time would tell. November 8th Progress Day in Piltover. The annual celebration was already in full swing. Brightly colored flags adorned the streets of Piltover, and even the normally narrow alleyways were filled with the festive atmosphere. In the high-class district, you could spot various family crests with the same golden gears. Many of the banners were even inlaid with gold to show off the wealth of these families. In the commoner district, children donned new clothes, carrying mechanical toys and playing joyfully. People in the streets were more forgiving and less inclined to scold the children when they accidentally bumped into them, instead offering a head pat and wishing them a happy Progress Day. Of course, the grown UPS followed up by advising the children to watch their steps and stay safe. Enforcers were stationed at various key points. Tents were set up in parks and open spaces, where groups of people carried wooden boards, chairs, and all sorts of odd objects. Craftsmen were busy constructing stages bearing the golden gears and unknown family crests on their banners. It was evident that this was a small-scale street exhibition venue, likely sponsored by a medium-sized family to showcase their inventions and creations, with the goal of increasing their sales. After all, Progress Day was not just the day of evolution for the people of Piltover, it was also the day of evolution for everyone who came to Piltover. During Progress Day, everyone who arrived in Piltover could enjoy the happiness it brought. It was a time of celebration, joy, and cheer. The atmosphere was so infectious that it lifted everyone's spirits, making them happy. Just look, everyone is smiling. Bright smiles adorned the faces of every resident of Piltover. And the merchants? They were even happier, particularly among the newcomers. After a year's wait, they could finally purchase things that were unavailable last year, and they could witness the new creations crafted by the people of Piltover this year. Although, if they wanted to buy, they might have to wait another year. Happy Progress Day! That's right, Happy Progress Day! Hey, buddy, would you like some blueberry pancakes? Sweet and delicious, and reasonably priced at just 8 copper coins during Progress Day. Oh, that's really affordable. Thank you, I'll take 2 pancakes. Here are your pancakes. It's a total of 15 coppers. I'll let you off with that 1 extra copper. Happy Progress Day! Thank you, Happy Progress Day! Yellow scaffolds, Constellation Avenue, Dockside Harbor, and even the Lumen Rose Estate. In different parts of Piltover today, there was one common phrase echoing everywhere. Happy Progress Day! But if you were to look down the winding chasms of the Undercity, beneath the bustling city of Piltover, you'd find that in the depths of Zaun, it was unusually quiet. The once bustling streets are no longer noisy. Black market traders have halted their lively underground markets, and street thugs are nowhere to be seen. Taverns and dance halls have closed their doors, and private shops have lowered their iron grates. People walking in the streets occasionally hear a few cheers from above, followed by resentful glares in return. They look to the sky with fierce expressions, as if they might attack at any moment. But when they lower their heads, their eyes are filled with sorrow. In the Boundary Market, the closest place to Piltover, the lively corridor from the past is now mostly empty. Those who truly hold Zaun in their hearts have left the Boundary Market today. They descend into the depths of the sump, heading to the depths of Zaun that they used to fear, even if they were Zaunites themselves. Because they know that during Progress Day, even the fiercest Zaunites will put away their fangs. Today is a day of remembrance. They will place small boats named Hope in the foul, toxic waters of the sump, the very waters that create the harsh living conditions for the Zaunites. Chapter 43 I Believe Him. On Progress Day, the Last Drop Tavern, unlike its usual lively self, became unusually quiet. At this moment, the bar had only one occupant, a woman. Sevika pushed open the small door blocking the bar counter, entered, and bent down to search in the cabinets below. She then skillfully retrieved a bottle of liquor, placed it on the bar, and opened it. Pouring the drink into a glass, the bottle emitted a pleasant glug sound, and finally, a smile crept onto Sevika's face. The quality of the alcohol was visibly excellent. Moreover, the bottle had no label on it, which meant it was likely Vander's private stash, reserved for his personal enjoyment. Taste and quality were beyond question. Vander had only two hobbies, smoking and drinking. Just as Sevika lifted an ice cube with a pair of tongs and gently dropped it into the glass, preparing to savor the fine liquor, a timid voice broke the silence. This voice shattered the tranquility and made Sevika's heart skip a beat. "Hey, Sevika, can you talk to me? I'm so bored all alone downstairs." The voice belonged to the blue-haired girl of Vander's two daughters, standing quietly near the staircase leading to the basement, gazing intently at Sevika. Her name was Powder, a rather peculiar name. Sevika turned her gaze toward her, noticing the girl's shifting, evasive eyes. "What do you want?" Sevika originally intended to reject her outright, but she remembered the strict order Vander had given her, protect Powder and spend time with her while ensuring her safety. "Am I just a babysitter, hey?" Sevika, who already had a bad temper, responded impatiently to Powder, saying, "What do you want to talk about?" "I'm so bored by myself, I want to chat with you," Powder replied. Moving her feet, she was dressed thickly to cope with the winter weather. Being close to the sea and located deep underground in Zaun, the temperatures in this harsh environment were much colder than in Piltover. She wore a weathered, blue short coat and a blue little hat. Beneath that, she had on several layers of pants, making her look chubby and plump. Powder sniffled and leaned her nose against the bar, unable to move too much due to the layers of clothing. She began by grabbing the table, then climbed onto the stool. Once she was seated, she gazed up at Sevika with her beautifully innocent blue eyes. "Can you play with me?" "No." "Why not?" Sevika didn't say anything, and Powder continued, "You don't seem busy at all. Look, you didn't go out with Vander. Even Six went out with him to do something, but you stayed here. You're useless, just like me. Do you really have no idea why I didn't go with them?" Sevika was at a loss for words in the face of those innocent, big eyes. There was an indescribable sense of powerlessness. She didn't particularly like Vander's two adopted daughters. There was a time when Sevika even believed that it was because of these two kids that Vander was becoming weak. Now that Vander had truly become the boss, with even the barons having to listen to him, Sevika still held this belief. Yet she didn't care about who was sitting in the boss's chair, and she didn't even care about her own position. What she cared about was only Zaun. Whoever could lead Zaun to independence and make the Zaunites lead a good life could be her boss. But Sevika didn't dare to be too harsh with this little girl. Six and Powder, she disliked both of them, but when it came to disliking Powder, Sevika had an even stronger feeling of not liking her. It was a sort of inexplicable aversion, a natural inclination to clash with her. "Why aren't you talking?" Powder mumbled. "By the way, can you pour me a glass of juice?" Sevika didn't reply but made a move. She rummaged below and brought out a bottle labeled with Powder's Special on it. "Ha, that Vander, why is this little girl liked by so many people?" The reason Sevika didn't dare to be too harsh with Powder was her fear that she would run to complain. Six was different. Six didn't seem like someone who would tattle after getting scolded. But Powder, the youngest daughter, always seemed to be the more favored one. Likewise, the youngest sister was no different. If Linwen knew that she had bullied Powder, there was a good chance that she wouldn't be getting up from her bed the next morning. She'd probably be sleeping on the street or hanging from somewhere. These things had happened before. Why didn't they take me with them? Is it because it's dangerous? But 6 gets to go. Why can't I? Oh, 6 is stronger than me, that's why. Powder bit on her straw, taking slow sips from the juice Sevika had prepared for her. Her eyes were slightly squinted, and her eyelids looked heavy, as if she couldn't open her eyes fully. Her beautiful gem-like blue eyes were squinted into slits, making her look somewhat mature. She continued to mutter. Wait, do you think they find me annoying? That doesn't make sense. Even Milo and Clagger didn't go, and little guy didn't go either. Are they annoyed with them too? Powder mumbled to herself, well, if that's the case, it's not because I'm annoying. But why didn't they take me with them? Hey, why didn't they take me with them? Sevika, who was listening to Powder's rambling. I've had enough. Babysitting is really not my work. Where are you going? Sevika walked toward the tavern's entrance, cup in hand, but Powder immediately widened her eyes and asked her. I'm going outside for a smoke. Is that okay? Of course, but you can smoke in front of me. I don't mind the smell of smoke, Vander always smokes in front of me. That's enough. You brat, stop talking to me. Sevika turned around, pointing her finger at her and raising her voice. I don't like you, is that clear? Oh well, it's your choice. I don't like you either. Holding her cup, Powder shrugged and watched Sevika with an indifferent expression. She knew very well that Sevika disliked her and 6. They all knew. Even though she was very young, she was clever. You don't like me, so I won't like you. And she's not afraid of her either. Sevika looks very fierce and terrifying. When Milo and Clagger see her, they would avoid her. But not me, because Linwen would protect me. With Linwen here, I'm not afraid of Sevika. Is Linwen coming back today? Powder asked again. He said he'd be back on Progress Day, I miss him. Sevika impatiently exclaimed, he's not coming back. I know you're lying to me. He will be back. Powder turned around, biting her straw as the juice in the cup reached its bottom. Well, I know he'll be back, but how long do I have to wait? It's been a month. That's okay, though. 6 said he'd come back on Progress Day. I believe 6, and I also believe him. Chapter 44 Silco and Powder. Are you here to watch over Vander's place? Standing outside, leaning against the wall, holding a glass and puffing on a cigar, Sevika was startled when she heard the voice. She looked at the person approaching and rolled her eyes dramatically. Sevika spat out her cigarette on the ground and crushed it with her boot. She spoke, Silco, you're here too early. Vander went to the mining district and hasn't returned yet. If you have business with him, come back tonight, or find another time. It's okay, I can wait until tonight. Silco brushed past Sevika, pushing open the doors of the Last Drop Tavern. He walked in directly. Then, he saw a girl with a hopeful expression on her face. But her expression immediately changed, as if she were disappointed. Little girl, I remember you. You're Vander's second daughter, right? Silco walked up to Powder and stared at her. To his surprise, his disfigured and terrifying face didn't seem to frighten her. But then again, in a place like Zaun, where gruesome appearances were common, his unique looks might even pass as handsome. I'm Powder. Powder. Silco examined Powder from head to toe and formed a faint smile. That's a very nice name. He looked at her and asked, Powder, would you be willing to pour a drink for your current guest? As the daughter of the bar owner, I assume you've done this before. Powder scratched her head and replied, you guessed wrong. Vander has never let me pour drinks. He doesn't allow me to touch alcohol, not even a bit. Look, I can only drink juice. Powder lifted her cup to show Silco, and it still had some undrunk residue inside. Silco moved closer to Powder's side and sat in the neighboring seat. He turned to look at her and said, well, you can try now. After all, Vander isn't here at the moment, and I won't report you to him. No, I promised Vander. He said it's a rule. Powder sniffled, Vander doesn't care about the other children in Zaun, but he insists that his own children follow his rules. If you're not old enough, you're not allowed to drink. 6 got a harsh scolding for sneaking some. Rules are meant to be broken, child. Silco gave a faint smile, rose from his seat, and walked behind the bar, where Powder didn't attempt to stop him. Although she had seen him many times, this was the first time Powder had spoken to him because Vander wasn't present. Bending down to search beneath the bar counter, Silco soon retrieved an unlabeled bottle of alcohol. He commented, after all these years, he still clings to this habit, thinking that an unmarked bottle will go unnoticed, just like how he turns a blind eye and deaf ear to Piltover's oppression and insults towards us. Silco placed the bottle on the table and, with his hand extended, gently pushed it toward Powder, who was now face to face with the bottle. In a calm tone, he continued, one day, when you grow up, you'll realize how absurd Vander's rules for you are. Zaun's children can't go without alcohol, child. This is one of our few joys. Hearing Silco's words, Powder shook her head and retorted, you're lying. Isn't juice also a source of happiness? You just like to drink alcohol, so you assume everyone should. Emulating Six's tone, Powder spoke like a little adult, saying, but I like juice, so I won't listen to you. Silco was taken aback. You just like to drink alcohol, so you assume everyone should. Silco squinted his eyes at Powder. This is just a offhand comment of a 10-year-old child. A 10-year-old child. If you want, you can try some juice, Powder suggested, pushing the bottle of alcohol away. She also slid her empty glass toward him, looking at Silco and saying loudly, by the way, pour me another glass. In Zaun, a loaf of bread with good appearance cost a family several days' wages. Similarly, high-quality juice was quite expensive in Zaun. Most of the time, juice was even more costly than alcohol. Therefore, Vander only occasionally let Powder have half a glass of juice. Today, she had already drunk a full glass, and it was Sevika who had poured it for her. If this uncle named Silco in front of her could pour her another glass, she would have had 2 glasses today. Her little face beamed with a smile, and her big eyes narrowed slightly, which left Silco somewhat baffled. Suddenly, he felt like this little girl was setting a trap for him, a suspicion that turned out to be quite accurate. Powder wanted to smoothly shift the blame for this situation onto him. Fruit juice? Silco asked. Yeah, let's drink it together. Silco fell silent for a moment, not entirely sure what he was thinking. Over the years of leaving the Undercity to build his own power and hiding in the shadows, he hadn't had a chance to relax, enjoy a quiet drink, or get a peaceful night's sleep. However, after meeting Vander that day with Linwen, Silco went back and had a very sound sleep. The future of Zaun didn't solely depend on him anymore. He had considered Linwen a fool who only got in his way, but now he had become a valuable ally. As Linwen had said, for Zaun to rise, it needed military strength, wealth, and technology. The main reason Zaun was so far behind Piltover was due to a lack of productive capacity. Now, Linwen was earning money in the upper city, Vander was building Zaun's strength, and Silco's main focus was with Singed. While both Shimmer and Hextech were being researched, those Hextech crystals were yet to be studied properly by Singed. His time had started to flow again, but he remained the same old Silco, entirely devoted to fighting for Zaun. However, he also realized that he needed some time to rest. At the very least, he deserved a moment to enjoy a drink. With these thoughts in mind, Silco put the alcohol bottle aside, bent down to rummage through the bar counter, and found a bottle of juice, still half full. He uncapped it and poured a full glass for Powder. Then he closed the lid, reached for the bottle of alcohol. Aren't you going to drink with me? Powder first held her juice happily, but when she saw Silco's next move, she immediately looked puzzled and asked him. Of course, I won't drink it, Silco said with a slight smile. Just like you said, I like to drink alcohol, so I choose to drink it. And you like fruit juice, so you're enjoying your juice now. Soon, other people will also want different drinks, and I hope we can all have our own choices and do what we like, rather than having preferences forced upon us, just like how I tried to make you drink alcohol earlier. Powder bit on her straw but didn't drink. She was just playing with it, looking at Silco in confusion. I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. That's normal, Powder. It doesn't matter. You'll understand when you're a bit older, Silco replied. Silco poured himself a drink and opened a square box emitting a chill with many ice beads inside. He elegantly picked up 2 and placed them into his glass. Then he asked Powder, would you like some ice? No way, it's winter now, Powder replied, shaking her head vigorously. Silco enjoyed his drink and took a glance at Powder, who was propped up on the table, holding the glass with a long straw. She took a sip and then spat some of it back into the glass, making it somewhat unpleasant. But to Silco, it was interesting. These were things only children did, things that Piltover children did. However, soon Powder lifted her head and looked at Silco, asking, "By the way, can you cook? I'm hungry." Silco was taken aback and immediately shook his head. "I can't cook, and I can't cook for anyone." Powder stared at Silco silently. Silco turned his head away from her. Then, Powder obediently propped herself down again. 20 minutes passed. Silco had consumed 2 glasses of alcohol and felt a bit tipsy. Powder had already finished her 3rd glass of fruit juice. She seemed to be trying to fill her stomach with fruit juice, but water was just water, and it couldn't satisfy her hunger. Then, a faint rumble emerged from the little girl's belly. Rumble. Silco. Rumble. The child's stomach growled again. Silco did his best not to meet Powder's gaze, but the space was small, and they were sitting face to face. Silco reluctantly stood up, placing his hands on the table and looking at Powder. He asked with resignation, "All right. Tell me." Powder blinked her eyes and raised her small hand, pointing towards the basement. Chapter 45 Harmless. Linwen led the way, taking a few sharp turns from Piltover. Behind him, Jace was assisting Victor down the stairs. "Why did you come along?" Victor asked, glancing at Jace, with Mr. Tallis focusing on supporting him. Jace replied, "My partner is no longer there, so what would I do alone in the lab?" He helped Victor down the stairs and continued, "Besides, we already promoted Hextech at the Kiraman family's event, but as you've seen, those people clearly didn't believe us." "Of course not, to them, Hextech is still an abstract concept," Victor said. "Merchants won't invest in something abstract, they lack the kind of vision that powerful families have," Victor added, with a faint smile. They walked down a silent dance corridor, and beneath the bridge was the deep heart of Zaun, his home. However, breathing the air rising from below, Victor felt a burning sensation in his lungs, causing him to cough several times. Hearing Victor's cough, Linwen turned back and asked, "Why are you stopping?" Victor, covering his mouth, looked at Linwen. Linwen handed him a cloak woven from the feathers of some unknown creature. Jace looked at the cloak with a disgusted expression. "Where did you pull this from, a chicken pen? Is this to keep Victor warm? Is this even useful? If you have nothing good to say, then don't say anything. No one sees you as a mute." The cloak given to Victor was, of course, the raptor cloak that Linwen had drawn. This was a strange turn of events, to say the least. Like the rejuvenation bead, this item had limited effect on Linwen, with its only real benefit being an additional 10 health points. Originally providing 30 points of armor, it now turned into 10 health points. As for the raptor cloak's passive, it granted acceleration when moving towards turrets and the void gate, but honestly, what use was this passive? Searching for turrets and the void gate? Let alone turrets, it was hard to imagine rushing towards the void in acceleration, that seemed like a death wish. Different from Jace's disdain, Victor, who had put on the cloak, had a momentary blank look, and then his lips moved slightly as he looked at Linwen. The shoulder pad was warm, and the discomfort in his body was greatly reduced. The burning sensation in his lungs lessened considerably. What was the effect of this cloak? However, in the end, Victor didn't say anything. He just used his hands to secure the purple short cloak on his shoulders, and the coughing gradually subsided. Linwen paused for a moment, then continued to walk forward. "Ding, the favorability of the machine herald towards you has increased significantly." This was another effect of the raptor cloak. It had double the recovery effect of the rejuvenation bead, restoring 1 health point per hour to the wearer, compared to the rejuvenation bead's 0.5. As they descended in the lift to the depths of Zaun, Victor appeared noticeably nervous. Unlike the places above, as soon as they arrived at the trench, upon opening the lift, there were quite a few eyes focused on them. These stares made Victor tense up. He was familiar with this place, and he knew what they were doing here. Does Zoran still? Does he still live here? Linwen didn't immediately understand Victor's meaning, but he soon smiled and said, "I've also advised him to move to Piltover, but he said he didn't want to live with the people from Piltover and didn't want to live on the boundary markets either. He's gotten used to living here, old Zoran can't leave Zaun anymore." But you don't have to worry, old Zoran is still in good health. Linwen glanced at the weakened Victor and felt like making a joke. After all, old Zoran's health must be better than Victor's right now. The effect of the rejuvenation bead was really excellent. While it didn't increase attributes or have any combat utility, it was a kind of super artifact for people with various illnesses. Honestly, Linwen felt that the rejuvenation bead could extend a person's lifespan and maintain their health. If someone had a dozen of these beads on them, their recovery rate would be amazing. How many health points did it add per hour? Linwen led Victor and Jace toward the dark alley. Along the way, Jace was getting anxious due to the people staring at them, and everyone around them seemed to be constantly watching them. Victor was also feeling uncomfortable. This was related to the clothing they were wearing. Linwen, too, was dressed in a way that made them stand out significantly from the people around them. Especially Jace, who was wearing a thick coat, a luxurious and extravagant piece with golden trim and black patterns. It was the kind of coat that immediately marked him as an upper city resident in the eyes of the Zaunites. And for someone like him to be in Zaun during Progress Day instead of staying in Piltover, who would believe that it wasn't for some mischief? As they approached the border of the dark alley, Victor grew even more nervous. He looked at some Zaunites in the distance smoking and carrying weapons by their sides. He reached out and placed his hand on Linwen's shoulder, whispering, "Linwen, let's take a different route. We need to keep our distance from them." Jace interjected, "Victor, they're a gang, right?" Victor nodded. The reason he didn't stay in Zaun had several aspects: his health issues, the culture of Zaun, and finally, the academic atmosphere in Piltover that attracted him. You see, when the Zaunite gang members go wild, public murders are a possibility. In Zaun, there's no rule of law to speak of. In response, Victor merely saw Linwen smile. "It's okay, just follow me. Don't worry, he's good at fighting." Jace patted Victor on the back, indicating that he shouldn't be concerned. Linwen was a beast with speed and strength far beyond that of an ordinary person. If it came down to a fight, Linwen could easily take down anyone. Furthermore, Jace didn't believe the Zaunites would dare to lay a hand on him. But only Victor knew that today was different from the usual. It was Progress Day in Zaun. He and Linwen had revealed their identities, so the Zaunites wouldn't make trouble for their own people today. However, Jace shouldn't try to follow them inside. Being killed was impossible, but being caught, beaten and thrown back to the upper city was a real possibility. But what happened next left Victor feeling quite strange. As they continued walking closer to the intimidating gang members, who had now noticed the situation and were standing up or holding weapons, Linwen kept walking forward with his hands in his pockets. Victor saw two of them put down their weapons and then nervously gestured to the others, as if they were saying something. The group of men jogged over, and as they got closer, one of them bowed to Linwen and said, "You're back, Victor." Linwen patted the man's shoulder and looked at him, recognizing his face. Linwen then asked, "I remember you. You're the one who always follows Sevika, right?" The man immediately stood up straight and replied, "Yes, it's me, Boss Linwen. Sevika is currently guarding the tavern. She asked us to watch over the Black Alley." "What about Vander?" "Boss Vander took the men to the mines, but he should be back soon." "Boss Linwen, are these two from Piltover?" "No, they're also from Zaun," Linwen said, in order to avoid any trouble, including Jace as a Zaunite. But when Linwen mentioned Jace, he seemed to remember something and added, "By the way, take them to old Zoran's place for me." "Sure." Jace immediately asked, "Aren't we going together?" "You and Victor go to old Zoran's first," Linwen smiled, patting Victor's shoulder. "Old Zoran must miss you a lot, he often talks about you to me. He'll be very happy to see you. Don't worry, Zaun is different from before now." As he spoke, Linwen raised his hand and, as he separated from them, gave orders to the 7 Zaunite gang members, "Protect them for me." "Yes." They armed themselves and surrounded Victor and Jace. "Let's go, old Zoran's house is this way." "Jace and Victor. What is he up to? Is he the harmless guy that Piltover University girls talk about? Is this what they call harmless?" Chapter 46 I'm back. Linwen's sudden decision to have Jace and Victor go to old Zoran's place had a reason behind it. Originally, Linwen intended to bring only Victor down, but somehow Jace insisted on coming along, which disrupted Linwen's original plan. Having Jace with them would have complicated the idea of introducing Victor to Singed. And bringing Jace to the last drop? Ha! The last thing they needed was for Jace to recognize Six and Powder as the thieves who had stolen his belongings, as that would bring up past grievances. Linwen was not willing to take that risk. As for the safety of Victor and Jace, Linwen had no worries. Zaun might be under Vander's control on the surface, but Zaun was still a vast place, and there were areas beyond Vander's reach. The entire Black Alley, however, was unquestionably safe. Black Alley was a secure place, and that's why Linwen had no concerns about leaving Victor and Jace with old Zoran. And he was carrying a bag with gifts for Six and Powder. Even Milo, Clagger, and Echo will get some, but the majority is for Six and Powder. Dash. This isn't tasty, Powder complained as she held a dark, egg-topped bread in her hands. Unfortunately, it lacked meat, and for her, it would have been a perfect dinner with some meat. Do you often act picky? Silco inquired, his expression complex as he watched Powder. Picky. Powder, despite her complaint about the food, obediently ate the bread that Silco had toasted for her. It was as hard as a rock, even after toasting, but the egg's flavor was delightful. She insisted, I'm not picky, I just like to eat delicious things. That's what being picky means, Silco said, raising his wine glass and leaning on the bar, peering at Powder. No, Linwen said, being picky means not eating things you don't like. But I eat the foods I don't like, so that's why I'm not picky. She quickly finished half of the large piece of bread and chewed while looking at Silco. She continued, pursuing tasty food is human nature, Linwen said. Does he always tell you unrealistic and useless things? Silco found Linwen less terrifying in that moment. Linwen's teachings and the way he looked after Powder had softened the otherwise ruthless enforcer from the Undercity. However, it also made him seem remarkably tender. Children in Zaun didn't have much of a childhood. From birth, they were thrust into the harsh environment. Most children of Zaun would lose their parents at a young age, and even those who had parents would struggle to survive on the streets once they reached an understanding age. This was Zaun's way of life. However, Powder was different. She had clearly been well protected by Linwen and Vander. She was sensible, but she had a playful and headstrong side as well, just like she was trying to make excuses to drink juice. Does he also cook for you? Silco inquired, a teasing tone in his voice. He couldn't help but be amused by the thought. After all, he couldn't imagine the man who typically wore a white robe, carried a short sword, and cut down the worst of the Undercity would return to the Black Alley and become a warm-hearted chef. Is that even possible? But when he saw the expression on Powder's face after asking, Silco understood. The answer was clear. It was true. Of course. Powder's eyes sparkled as she praised Linwen loudly and proudly. She enumerated all the wonderful things Linwen did. Linwen is an amazing cook, even better than Vander, or any of those food vendors. He often roasts jerky for me and Six. Oh, Milo and Clagger get some too. He can even grill fish and make a pot of delicious soup, then throw in pieces of meat and vegetables while it's still boiling. And we eat it right from the pot. Do you really like him? Silco interrupted Powder's words and asked her suddenly. I like Linwen the most. Powder responded enthusiastically. Even more than Vander. Silco continued his questioning. Powder hesitated for a moment, clearly not expecting such a question. She looked quite conflicted. It's a different kind of liking. Silco was intrigued by her response. It's different? Well, I like Vander the most too, but Linwen is different. Observing the young girl sitting there, fidgeting with her fingers and looking utterly conflicted, Silco found it rather amusing. Silco reasoned that Linwen probably didn't know about this kind of Powder. Based on Powder's description of Linwen, he seemed to treat her like a little sister. But just as Silco was about to speak, standing up and clearing his throat, the tavern's door swung open. Silco glanced at the figure who entered the tavern, promptly shutting his mouth and taking a step back. Well, it seemed like the opportunity to uncover the Undercity enforcer's little secret was gone. Not to worry, there would be plenty of other chances. After all, a 10-year-old girl wouldn't be able to keep any secrets. As for Powder, she immediately turned her head toward the entrance, her beautiful blue eyes filled with boundless colors. It was as if her entire world had just been filled in that single moment. Linwen. Jumping down from her chair, Powder spread her arms wide and made a beeline for the door. Standing just a couple of meters away was a young man with black hair. Despite the considerable distance, Powder leaped high into the air and lunged forward, determined to reach him. The distance might have been a challenge for a 10-year-old who stood at just about 1 meter and 3 centimeters tall, but she had no fear of falling. She knew he would catch her. As expected, 2 hands reached out from beneath her armpits and gently lifted her high into the air. Linwen held Powder high above his head, gazing down at her with a warm smile. In response, Powder broke into a toothy grin, showcasing her teeth. She had a lovely set of teeth, but she had only recently lost one, which was visible in this particular angle. She was incredibly happy, so much so that she even forgot to hide the gap from her missing tooth. In front of Six, she was quite particular about not showing her missing tooth. She might be young, but she was already quite self-conscious. Linwen found it amusing, a young jinx with a missing tooth. "I'm back!" Linwen exclaimed. "Why did you take so long?" "I've been waiting for 2 days, and Six was waiting for you every day too," Powder replied. "Well, I had business to attend to up there," Linwen said, not bothering to look at Silco, who stood behind them. Silco simply watched, feeling the familiar sensation. Back when Singed was around, was he also ignored like this? Linwen inquired, "So, were you missing me a lot?" Powder nodded enthusiastically. "Yes." Linwen didn't hesitate to scoop her up into his arms, and Powder, well accustomed to this, wrapped her little arms around Linwen's neck. And then she heard Linwen's voice. "Powder, I missed you too." Chapter 47 Small Gifts. "By the way, why is it just you at home? Where's Six?" "I'm back, why isn't she coming out?" "Six went out with Vander. They left me alone at home." Powder had said this to Silco before, but when she repeated it to Linwen, her tone had lost the slight complaint she had with Silco. Linwen approached Silco with Powder in his arms. "Why are you here?" Silco looked at Linwen with a smile, not a cold one. He didn't answer Linwen's question but instead doing bartender work. He took out a glass from the cabinet, gently shook it, and asked Linwen, "What would you like to drink?" Juice." Linwen apparently still wasn't fond of alcohol. But Silco shrugged slightly, his face showing a teasing smile. "I'm sorry, but we've run out of juice for today." Linwen lowered his head, and he noticed the empty juice bottle on the bar counter, a large container capable of holding 3 liters. However, it was now empty. Next to it, there was an empty bottle with a chewed-up straw. Linwen had a keen sense of smell, and he could detect the scent of juice in the glass. Not to mention, there was also a bitten, chewed straw in the glass. He turned to look at Powder, who had been looking at him and immediately turned her head away. She avoided looking at Linwen, especially avoiding eye contact. But Linwen raised an eyebrow and asked, "How much juice did you have today?" 1, 2, Powder replied hesitantly, still not looking at Linwen. "Are you sure?" Linwen pressed, teasing her. Powder turned her head towards Linwen, raised her hand, and extended 3 fingers, making eye contact. "If Vander finds out, he'll be mad. It's not like I wanted to drink it myself. Sevika made me drink it, and then he made me drink 2 more, Powder quickly pointed towards Silco, trying to shift the blame to him. After all, if Linwen found out, he might just scold her a bit. But once Vander found out, he would probably punish her, maybe making her stand in the corner or kneel on the bed for half an hour, or something similar. That was the Vander family rule. She didn't want Linwen to come home and find out, only for her to end up punished. That wouldn't be good. Linwen looked at Silco, wearing an expression that seemed to apologize for his child's mischievousness. But in Linwen's eyes, both Powder and Six were a bit rebellious. Sometimes they really weren't obedient children. Powder and Six definitely didn't qualify as well-behaved kids. After all, they had even stolen from Jace's place. Even if Six framed it as robbing from the rich to help the poor, it was still theft. However, Linwen could understand that the survival environment in Zaun was different from Piltover. But in the future, Linwen thought this would gradually change. "I'm glad you trust me. I thought you would unquestioningly believe her words," Silco replied, taking a glass of alcohol from Linwen and continuing, "After all, I can tell that you care a lot about her." Linwen placed Powder on the bar and took the glass from Silco. He sipped a bit and then said to Silco, "Silco, I've noticed you often tend to misinterpret people's intentions, like you're doing now. I don't trust you blindly, I just understand her very well." Linwen reached over and playfully tapped Powder's head while she looked down in embarrassment. She hadn't expected Linwen to return at this time, she had thought he wouldn't be back until tomorrow. Moreover, she hadn't anticipated him discovering this situation. When dealing with Linwen, Powder could have boldly lied to Vander about it. After all, Vander didn't mind these things, and Zaunite children shouldn't be expected to never steal, deceive, or tell lies. However, Linwen had made it clear that he didn't like her lying. So, since the blame hadn't been shifted elsewhere, which was the truth, Powder could only admit to it now. I admit it, I asked them for it, Powder said sheepishly. Linwen patted her head and shook his head, saying, you'll have to discuss this with Vander. No, Linwen. I know I messed up. You can't, you can have only 1 glass of juice a day, that's what you promised Vander. Don't pout. Linwen reached out and grasped Powder's mouth that she had just pouted, playfully saying, I brought you and Six some nice things. Would you like to see them early? What nice th? Powder's mouth was held shut by Linwen, and her head bobbed with Linwen's hand movement. Her words became muffled. Silco watched this scene silently. He was more humane than he had imagined. If he had known Linwen's softer side earlier, he could have come up with a better way to deal with Linwen. Linwen's vulnerability was quite obvious, and the girl named Powder was one of his weaknesses. However, that seemed to be unnecessary at the moment. He and Linwen had already established a rapport. Can you stop ignoring me? Silco said helplessly. I've been waiting for you for quite a while, and I waited for Vander for most of the afternoon. You came early. Linwen looked at Silco in surprise, then back at Powder. He had one hand covering her little mouth and the other gently pressing her small head. Linwen pushed her head like a ball, lightly nudging it in different directions. Powder felt annoyed but accepted it, as Linwen had done similar things many times. Are you telling me you spent the whole afternoon with her? Linwen asked. Aren't you worried? Silco responded. Not particularly. Although you appear to be the type who plays mind games, a cunning and despicable person who stabs others in the back, being with you actually gives me peace of mind. Silco. I'll take that as a compliment. I certainly meant it as one. So, Silco, what did you and Powder do this afternoon? I just mentioned that I find you trustworthy, but you know your bad habit. It seems you enjoy brainwashing people. Every time I see you, you try to manipulate me. Really? You're overthinking it. You always tend to overthink things. Linwen looked disdainfully at Silco and said, see, you're at it again. Silco. Come to think of it, did he really try to brainwash Powder earlier today? Well, after many years of painting enticing pictures, recruiting people, it had become Silco's professional habit. You didn't come down just to accompany her and her sister, did you? I assume you have many questions for me and Vander, Silco said. Silco had another drink. With this high-proof liquor from Vander, he was already feeling a bit woozy. Let's wait for Six to come back, and we'll talk together. Linwen pulled out 2 elegant elongated boxes. I brought some small gifts. Chapter 48. It's not allowed? Vander, you see, I was right, wasn't I? I told you I can handle myself. I took down 3 people. 3. I've grown up, Six proclaimed proudly. In a certain area of Zaun, on the way to the Undercity, a young girl leaped forward while tilting her head, watching the burly man beside her. The massive man was quietly puffing on a cigar and, upon hearing her, displayed a smile that conveyed a mix of gratification and exasperation. It was a smile that carried both contentment and a touch of exasperation. But you still got hurt. I clearly told you not to rush forward. You need to use your advantages effectively. Haven't Linwen taught you defense? Vander questioned. Defense? Six scoffed, muttering, I won't hide behind others, and I won't defend. I just need to attack. Vander, the best defense is a good offense, she added. Who taught you that? Vander raised an eyebrow. Linwen, she replied. With that response, Vander swiftly grabbed her head, and his large hand ruffled her hair, making it messy. Why are you just like him? I spent so long this morning combing my hair, Six complained, then quickly crouched and took a few steps forward. After turning back around, she looked at Vander and the multitude of henchmen behind him, a sea of people packed together. This was the human traffic jam Linwen often referred to. It was he who's like me, not the other way around, Vander said somewhat enviously. Both Six and Powder were closer to Linwen than they were to him. Vander couldn't help but feel a little discomfort by that fact. As for the bruise on Six's face and the slightly swollen eye. Ha, that's because they had a brawl near the mining area. Vander knew there might be a fight when he and his people went to the canal this morning to set a small boat adrift as part of a ritual. After all, there were still folks in Zaun who wouldn't listen to his leadership. Vander got involved this time, and he was not gentle. He wore iron knuckle dusters. Though they were old-fashioned and had nothing to do with mechanical engineering, with his strong physique and a wealth of combat experience, a punch from Vander could easily shatter someone's jaw. Yes, Vander had started using force to keep Zaun in check. Anyone who didn't obey, he would hit them, and he'd hit hard. He'd keep hitting until they fell in line. Just as Silco said, peace, stability, and fairness were matters for consideration after Zaun gained independence. As long as Zaun remained oppressed by Piltover, there was no place for fairness. For those who refused to join them, accusing us of being hoodlums and disruptors, our job was to punch them in the jaw to give them a baby-like slumber. As for whether we were right or wrong, later generations would be the judges. Silco's words made a lot of sense. At least, they gave Vander a reason to use his fists. He could set aside his emotions and throw a punch with a cold heart. Punches without emotions were the most potent punches. Are we going again tomorrow? Six asked excitedly while jumping and dodging, landing a couple of swift jabs. No, tomorrow we'll stay in the Black Ally, Vander replied. Hey, is that enough? It's enough for tomorrow. It's not advisable to fight on this day. What about after that? Six inquired. She had finally participated in a fight. If there were more opportunities, she wasn't going to give them up. After all, she was a bit of a violent person at heart. However, Vander let out a grunt and said, "It's not your concern." 6. They continued to banter as they made their way to the Black Alley, where Vander noticed Silco's people. "That guy is here again," Vander remarked. Six had noticed him too and couldn't help but roll her eyes. She didn't particularly like that man because he looked dangerous. Once they entered the Black Alley, Vander's people dispersed. Those who could accompany Vander to the Black Alley were the trusted ones. Vander, with Six and Clagger, entered the last drop. As he opened the door, he immediately removed his heavy coat, which was stained with blood. He didn't want Powder to see it, especially considering that she might ask for a hug. As a father, he didn't want his daughter to be exposed to blood. However, as he extended his arms, he was taken aback by what he saw. Powder was indeed not in the basement, but she wasn't rushing up to Six or seeking a hug. Instead, she sat a distance away, holding a large doll. Vander couldn't help but say, "I never thought you'd be doing this with her, Silco." In Silco's hands was a worn-out little stuffed bunny with many patches. He paused for a moment and then spoke with a hoarse voice, "Sometimes, it's good to maintain innocence." Vander chuckled and said, "Is that your reason for playing house with her?" Six, on the other hand, darted out from Vander's side. Vander let out a sigh. As the saying goes, girls grow up fast. The moment the door opened, Six was stunned, but then she rushed forward. Her messy pink hair resembled a bird's nest, and she ran quickly, displaying her tomboyish nature. Then, "Ugh! Violet, are you trying to knock me out?" If he had been a frail person, like Victor, he would probably have passed out instantly after such a collision. Even Jace, who could probably catch her, would be left feeling queasy from the impact. But Six was no ordinary girl. With her speed and strength, if Jace did manage to catch her, he would likely feel nauseous from the impact. Linwen, however, just pretended to be in pain, groaning a few times. "Stop pretending. I know you're not hurt." Hugging Linwen closely, Six's voice grew deeper as she said. Linwen held her tighter as he laughed heartily and said, "Powder is like this, and now you're the same. I've got to say, you two really are sisters. But Powder is light. What about you, Six? Have you gained weight recently?" "Shut up!" Six retorted, raising her head to bump Linwen's chin. "I'm not fat. It's muscle. It's all muscle." "Muscle? Let me see." Before Six could respond, Powder sitting next to them couldn't stand it any longer and exclaimed, "No touching." Linwen turned his head to look at Powder, puzzled. Six also glanced at Powder and asked, "Powder?" Powder was clutching her doll and flicking it around rapidly as she hesitated to explain, I meant, it's not allowed, Linwen. You know, it's inappropriate." 6 was even more confused. Weren't they always like this, with no issues regarding gender differences? But Powder, how come you can do it? 6 asked as she sat up and looked at Powder. I am still a child. I'm still a kid, but you're an adult, 6. So it's not allowed. Powder's voice was exceptionally loud. Dash. Their relationship is really good. Listening to the commotion of the people around him, Silco shrugged his shoulders. He handed a glass of wine to Vander. Thank you. Vander instinctively took it, but his expression instantly darkened when he smelled the wine. This was the high-end wine he had kept, obtained from Nakas. It was the sort of alcohol that should be savored. Vander spoke solemnly, my wine, Silco. How many glasses have you had? Hey. Silco paused for a moment. With this drink, it was probably his 5th or 6th glass, counting from the last one. But he couldn't recall for sure. The containers were small glasses, about half the size of Powder's palm, but even with small servings, it was clear that the amount of wine left in the bottle had diminished significantly after 5 or 6 glasses. Ain't wine meant to be drunk? Isn't that right, brother? Silco acted nonchalant. Vander. You're right, brother. Chapter 49 Hex Phone. All right, 6, and you too, Powder, both of you get off Linwen. Yes, I mean now, no discussion. We have something to say. After watching 6 and Powder cling to Linwen for an hour, Vander finally couldn't take it anymore. It was nighttime, and outside the Last Drop Tavern, you could occasionally hear footsteps, marching in an orderly fashion, accompanied by soft chanting. It was an old tradition of the Black Ally. Today, many elders would parade at night, holding paper boats, carrying their hopes and dreams, and paying their respects to those who perished in the disasters. In front of them, Silco had lost count of how many glasses he had consumed. However, it was clear he was getting drunk. He sat on the floor, swaying unconsciously. This both amused and left Vander speechless. Silco, who had always been cautious, was now drunk in front of him. What could this mean? The answer was clear. Silco hadn't guarded against him. Vander, Silco. Their past stories and shattered memories hadn't been erased by time. They still existed with their scars. The old bridge, still broken to this day, but they had built a new one. Since it was all in the past, it was best to discard it, hatred, annoyance, resentment, all those useless things. Okay, 6 nodded and reached out to grasp Powder's wrist, intending to pull her down. However, Linwen held onto her and said, Vander's right, I do have something to discuss, but I need a little help. Vander nodded. When 6 looked his way, he could only give a slight nod in response. Then I'll stay here. It was Linwen who asked me to stay. 6 promptly sat down again, her head swaying. She was naturally restless. Vander, Silco. Linwen opened his backpack, took out a bunch of papers, and then placed the 2 boxes he had previously revealed right in the middle. The group looked at the pile of papers and 2 beautiful long boxes. I brought these from the upper city, Linwen began, holding up the stack of papers and speaking to Silco. These contain the production process of Hextech gemstones. I've documented most of it. As for the instruments needed, you can have Singed check if he can manufacture them. This was also why Linwen didn't bring Jace and Victor to the tavern. Although it seemed a bit unfair, he could only apologize silently to Jace in his heart. After all, Linwen's intentions for approaching Jace from the beginning were not entirely pure. So soon? Silco squinted at Linwen, saying, it's only been a little over a month, and you've got this already? Normally, the production process should be a trade secret, right? To be honest, I'm curious about your relationship with him. Linwen scratched his head, smiling helplessly. Honestly, I do feel a bit guilty doing this kind of thing, but there's no other way. It's for Zaun. All right, don't talk about these useless things. Linwen snapped his fingers, and 6, who was sitting beside him, reflexively sat up, tilting her head as she looked at Linwen. What's up? I need your help. Placed in the center among everyone was, of course, the hex phone. Choose one, which one do you like? 6 squinted, looking down at the hex phone. After a moment, she asked, is this for me and Powder? Yes, one for each of you. Are you trying to trick me with this kind of stuff? You promised to bring me and Powder gifts, and I've been looking forward to it for a long time, 6 said, feigning annoyance. I'll let Powder pick first. 6 had always been a good older sister. I want the blue one. Powder quickly chose a long box that matched her hair color. The other one was a light black long box. 6 held the hex phone in her hand, feeling its comforting warmth. Though it wasn't very cold in Zaun during the winter, having something like this to keep your hands warm was still a blessing. Alright, the hand-warming effect is pretty good, I'll reluctantly accept it. 6 grabbed the hex phone and said to Linwen. Hearing this, Linwen remarked, don't mess around. He patted 6's head, instructing her, take it downstairs later. I estimate it's only about 7 to 8 meters. But right now, we're not testing the distance. Linwen pointed to a button on the long box and said, later, it should light up, and you just press this button, only this one. Be sure not to press the red button next to it, that button is for rejecting calls. 6 nodded, her finger touching a blue button, and she asked Linwen, just press this one. Yes, just press that one. Quit acting mysterious. With the phone in hand, 6 ran down to the basement. He estimated the distance to be at most around 7 to 8 meters. However, the experiment wasn't about the distance. The 2 new Hextech phones created by Zevi were not only more exquisite than the first attempt but also had an extended range. Currently, the phone's reception range was approximately 50 meters. This distance was still not satisfactory for Linwen and Zevi, but it was more than enough as a gift for 6 and Powder. Now it's just a toy, but it's a meaningful one. Both Vander and Silco were curious, watching Linwen closely. They had no idea what Linwen was up to. Just as 6 had mentioned earlier, they were all curious about the mysteriousness surrounding the situation. When 6 called out from below, Linwen, I'm ready. Linwen turned his attention to Powder. Now is it my turn? Do I need to go down too? Powder asked, holding the Hextech communicator. No, you don't need to go down. Powder, press the blue button first, and then press the middle button twice, Linwen instructed. Powder nodded, following Linwen's instructions. She pressed the blue button first, and then... Ding! A crisp sound rang out, followed by a faint sizzling sound, accompanied by a blue halo emanating from the long box Powder was holding. It was a series of concentric rings of light. Vander was almost about to rush up and push Powder away, but Silco stopped him. This is Hextech, Silco said, having seen this before. As for Powder, she also realized what was happening. The light and the sizzling sounds without harming her seemed similar to the effect after the stone explosion. Quick, press that button. Oh okay. Powder immediately pressed the button twice. Then, the blue light ring slightly expanded and... Poi! A soft cracking sound followed. What's with this light? What's going on? That was terrifying. What's happening up there? Why haven't they called me up yet? From the long box that Powder was holding came a clear voice. It was 6's voice. She was muttering to herself, and then, Powder looked up in terror and exclaimed, Linwen, V6 is trapped in the box. Powder. Linwen hadn't said anything, and neither had Silco or Vander. 6 spoke up, is that Powder? Wait. Why can't I hear your voice? Powder blinked her eyes. The tears she thought she had shed earlier when she believed 6 was trapped in the magical device were now withdrawn. She looked at Linwen in amazement, and the one who started it all burst into hearty laughter. Don't worry, Powder. 6 isn't trapped, she's right below, and 6, what you're hearing is Powder's voice. Is this magic? 6's voice was extremely loud. Meanwhile, Silco's expression on the side changed. He had gone from slightly tipsy and hazy-eyed to completely sober, and he was now looking at Linwen's back with a mixture of shock and fear. What in the world was this? Year 978 AE, Noxian calendar, November 8. The world's first practical telephone was born in Zaun. The City of Freedom, Zaun. Chapter 50. Let's get started. Linwen, what is this thing, really? It can transmit sound? Is this the power of Hextech technology you mentioned? That was Silco's voice, with a slight tremor in it. Silco was genuinely taken aback. His first thought was whether this thing had a distance limitation. If it didn't, it could be incredibly powerful. At a time when the continent was filled with conflict, Nakus pushing north into Fruljord, westward against Demacia, and now rumors of Nakus planning to attack the enigmatic Eastern Isles. As this land's most war-loving empire, Silco was convinced that Noxians would stop at nothing to acquire such a device. It had the potential to revolutionize the way information was relayed. On the battlefield, messages often took weeks to travel back and forth, but with this device, issuing orders, scouting the enemy, and more could become remarkably simple. Silco, who had spent years in seclusion building up his power, immediately saw the potential. Vander, too, was surprised. He marveled at the idea that this device could undoubtedly fetch a significant sum of money. Linwen mentioned that he was going to make money, but to achieve this within just over a month? That was incredible. Then, in Powder's hands, the device emitted sound. Yet, Linwen, what is this thing? How can I hear your voices? You can hear me voice too, right? This is incredible. Is it magic? It must be magic. 6, who was below, was yelling with excitement. Linwen could vividly imagine the scene. 6 was holding the phone, jumping up and down with her short pink hair bouncing wildly, making a fuss, and exclaiming enthusiastically. 6 was indeed a tomboy, caring little about superficial matters. But fortunately, she was very beautiful. She didn't care about appearances, so why should anyone else? Linwen didn't know how to respond to her. All right, you come up first. Who come up? You, who else is down there? Linwen said to the Hextech phone. I'm coming up right away. Stomping footsteps. In just a few seconds, 6 came running up, still carrying the Hextech phone. She rushed to Linwen, asking enthusiastically, what is this thing? Why can we hear each other? When I speak, can you hear it too? We can hear it. Powder chimed in from the side. This is a Hextech phone. Its purpose is to transmit sound, just like what we did earlier. 6 held the long box excitedly and asked Linwen, is this for me? Weren't you dissatisfied with it earlier? Not at all. Women are fickle, and 6 was no exception. She immediately added, I'm very satisfied, super satisfied. What do you think, Powder? Little Powder held the Hextech phone, nodding enthusiastically, and said, Linwen, I'm super satisfied too. Linwen waved his hand. Don't worry, this is for both of you. I promised I'd bring you something good, and this is considered a good thing, right? Right. 6 and Powder immediately cheered and high-fived each other. Calm down. Linwen quickly tried to calm them down and held 6 back, saying, you still need to do me a favor. What favor? After receiving a gift, and especially one that seemed to be a magical item, 6 was incredibly excited. She patted her chest, and exclaimed, don't worry, I promise to complete the mission. Very simple, you take Powder outside and help me test the range. Range? Yes, there are only 4 Hextech phones in the world right now. The 2 you have are the Mark I models, and the other 2 Hextech phones are prototypes. So, as the first and second people in the world to own Hextech phones, I need you and Powder to help me measure the data. Okay. 6 immediately took Powder and headed out, leaving Vander and Silco behind. Is this thing invented by your friend in Piltover? Silco asked, his voice tinged with complexity. It had only been a short time, less than 2 months. From the moment Linwen told him about Hextech to the development of Hextech, it had been just 2 months. In comparison, Shimmer and Hextech were in completely different leagues. Could the Zaunites never catch up with the Piltover people? What was the difference exactly? No, to be precise, it was my invention, Linwen smiled and said, revealing a surprising fact to Silco. You invented it. Commissioned someone to make it, but it was my idea. Does that count as my invention? Linwen chuckled. Silco nodded. All right, it counts. But, did you still have this kind of talent? Silco wanted to say, why didn't I know? I thought I knew Linwen better, after all, we've been rivals for many years. There's a saying, isn't there? The person who knows you best is your enemy. Silco thought he knew Linwen better, but he never imagined that Linwen was not only a powerful Siskin but also engaged in scientific research. Vander interjected, Silco, he's the adopted son of the old Zoran and studied mechanical engineering with him for 5 years. I know that, but from what I know, his skills were at the stage of tinkering with things. Silco, still nursing a hangover from drinking earlier, rubbed his head, then continued, but it's clear that this kind of thing is not something an amateur could come up with. That's true. Hey, what are you guys talking about? The person involved is right here. Linwen said unenthusiastically, at least show me a little respect. In any case, I hold the copyright for Hextech phones. In the future, anyone who wants to make Hextech phones will have to pay me for the copyright. And only I can establish the information base station. Hextech phones not under my control will require a franchise fee to use. How long do we have to wait? How long until your Hextech phones are available on the market? Silco rubbed his chin. In contrast to Vander, he had more of a business mind. He quickly continued, in Piltover, this kind of thing could fetch a good price. But if you really want to get a good price, you have to sell it to Noxus. No, Linwen shook his head. Why? The Noxians would be willing to trade a fortune in steel, weapons, gold, and materials for it. I'm sure they need it. Just like buying my shim. Silco suddenly fell silent. He closed his mouth. Because he saw a change in Linwen's eyes. The previously laid-back boy turned cold and said to Silco in a deep voice, I did mention that you are prohibited from selling shimmer, right? Relax, Linwen, I'm a man of my word. Silco made his signature shrug and explained, I didn't sell it in Zaun. I just had people take it by boat and smuggle it to Noxus to sell. As long as it makes them stronger, the Noxians won't care about the side effects. Really? Of course, things are going well in Zaun right now. I won't jeopardize our agreement. At least, not until the side effects of shimmer are eliminated. Linwen nodded and eased his demeanor. Hextech phones are not yet in their final form. They have limited range for now. How far? Vander asked. The ones in the lab are being improved, and it's expected that they'll be able to reach a range of about 200 meters shortly. The ones 6 in powder have right now have a range of about 50 meters. That's certainly not something we can sell. If we sell such a thing to them, they'd resort to violence, Silco said. But it won't take long. At most 2 years, and Hextech phones will become widespread. At that time, we might even be able to make calls from here to Noxus. Linwen affirmed. As long as the technology is sufficiently advanced and there are enough Hextech gems, building multiple information base stations, A transmitting to B, B to C, C to D, and so on, distance won't be an issue at all. Silco, who had initially considered this thing to be a mere toy or a chicken rib, hesitated for a moment. Linwen anticipated what he wanted to say and cut him off, but there's a condition. Tell me, and Vander and I will do our best. Exactly. Vander added. Silco was extremely serious about this. With his intellect, he had already envisioned a glimpse of the future. If what Linwen said could truly be achieved, then Linwen would likely become the wealthiest man in both cities. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but even if not the richest, he'd undoubtedly join the upper echelons. Yes, that's right, thanks to the Hextech phones. The production method of Hextech gems. Linwen shrugged helplessly and said, I've already heard him. He revealed the production method of Hextech gems to me without any hesitation, doing it in front of me openly and transparently. He didn't treat me as an outsider. He treated me as a brother, and I only hope this is the first and last time. Let Sinj take those data and decipher the method for creating the gems as soon as possible. Linwen's voice was firm and powerful. The plan was proceeding step by step. Zaun had also truly taken the first step. But Linwen had some doubts about himself for a while. Jace had really treated him as a friend, a brother. But Linwen? Linwen had used Jace. At first, he saw Jace as just a character in a game, thinking about stealing Hextech technology and losing the activation card. But, like 6 in powder, Jace was also a real person. Over time, Linwen had come to consider Jace as a friend as well. But, in the grand scheme of the city, personal friendships had to be temporarily set aside. Iron brothers like Silco and Vander had become enemies because of differing ideologies. So, what about Linwen and Jace? Their ideologies also didn't match. Zaunites and Piltoverians were destined not to merge. It was like oil and water, no matter how close they got, they were separated by a thin membrane. It was like fire and water, someday, one side would be extinguished. Linwen shook his head, no longer dwelling on those thoughts, and with a resolute and powerful voice, he said to the 2 men in front of him. Silco, Vander, let's get started. We need to produce our own Hextech gems.
Thanks for listening.